High in the Andes, where jagged peaks pierce the clouds and glaciers carve silent corridors through stone, the mountains guard secrets that resist explanation. Explorers and locals alike have recorded strange phenomena: untraceable lights flickering over snowy ridges, eerie metallic harmonies echoing across desolate valleys, vanished caravans leaving only frozen tracks, and whispers of unseen presences moving through ice and rock. In this journey across the high Andes, you will trace the paths of climbers and miners, descend into glacial crevasses, and confront the enigmatic forces that have puzzled generations. Each location carries its own inexplicable story, from spectral sounds at Pocsi Ridge to the drifting footprints on Chimborazo, revealing a landscape where the natural world and the mysterious intertwine, and where the mountain's secrets endure, silent but unmistakably present. The disappearance at Laguna del Inca. The strange disappearance near Laguna del Inca has lingered in mountaineering circles for decades, spoken of quietly among guides who know the harsher moods of the Andes, and repeated by travellers who hear the story while passing through the narrow routes that wind toward the Chilean high Cordillera. The lake sits high above the valley floor in the Portillo region, surrounded by escarpments that rise sharply toward the peaks, creating a basin where wind, light and sound behave in unusual ways. Its waters remain cold throughout the year, fed by snowmelt from the surrounding cliffs, and known for their striking depth of colour, a deep bluish green that seems almost unnatural against the pale rock. Climbers often remark on the sudden silence that settles around the lake at dusk, a silence so complete that footsteps on gravel echo across the water and return in odd, curved paths that do not match the angle of the shoreline. It was in this place, on a morning marked by clear skies and a thin night frost, that a mountaineer walked a short distance from camp and never returned. The party had established its base on a flat section overlooking the lake, a location used by trekkers for decades because it offers sheltered ground and a stable approach to the surrounding ridges. The missing climber was a skilled alpinist who had completed numerous high-altitude routes across the central Andes, familiar with the erratic weather patterns that sweep across the mountains with little warning. According to those present, he left camp shortly after sunrise to stretch his legs and inspect the terrain for the day's planned ascent, choosing to follow a narrow path that curved along the snow-covered shoreline. His companions watched him move steadily across the frosted ground, pausing only once to glance toward the ridge before continuing. There was nothing unusual in his movements, nothing hurried or hesitant, and the lake remained calm beneath a weak morning light that reflected off the surface in muted, shifting bands. Searchers later noted that the shoreline in this area maintains a consistent gradient and offers unobstructed views for several hundred meters in both directions. Snow accumulates in thin layers during cold nights, often leaving faint crystalline crusts that preserve footprints with remarkable clarity. For this reason, the party assumed they would find his tracks leading onward or returning toward camp. Instead, they discovered a clear set of footsteps walking directly toward the water, paced evenly and without sign of distress, followed by a sharp ending where the snow was unbroken on either side. The tracks did not angle away, fade into scattered impressions, or descend onto hidden rock. They simply stopped near the edge of the lake, as though the climber had stepped into the water or vanished in the space between two steps. The lake's shoreline shows no sudden drops, and the shallows extend several meters before reaching deeper areas. Yet no clothing, equipment, or broken ice suggested that he had fallen through or attempted to wade in. Rescue teams arrived from the lower valleys after the alarm was raised, bringing experienced search and rescue personnel accustomed to the challenges of high-altitude operations. They used long poles to probe beneath the surface of the water, focusing on sections where silt shifts unpredictably and can trap heavy objects. Divers from the local police force joined the effort despite the cold temperatures, sweeping arcs near the shoreline and inspecting recesses where submerged rock formations create darker pockets. Visibility beneath Laguna del Inca is limited by fine glacial sediment suspended in the water, yet divers were able to explore the shallow basin with relative accuracy. Nothing was found, not even fragments of gear that might have broken loose during a fall. The rescue teams then expanded their search outward, examining ridges, ravines and wind channels that cut across the slopes above the lake. These areas contain loose gravel, volcanic fragments and occasional patches of hard ice that can shift underfoot, but no indication appeared that the missing climber had climbed away from the shoreline or retreated into higher ground. Helicopter crews scanned the area during midday light when shadows are minimal and rock contrasts become clearer, paying particular attention to crevasses that sometimes form beneath overhanging snow layers. Despite several days of aerial and ground searches, the only physical evidence remaining was those single undisturbed tracks ending at the water's edge. Local workers familiar with the lake offered observations that rescue teams recorded but could not fully explain. Some described the way sound travels unusually across the water, bending and returning from unexpected angles when the air cools rapidly after sunrise. Others noted that the wind can shift abruptly within the basin, creating short-lived columns of cold air that leave the surrounding environment strangely still. Geological studies of the area indicate that the basin's shape amplifies echo patterns and influences how light reflects off the water, sometimes creating optical effects that make distances appear distorted. None of these phenomena, however, accounted for the lack of secondary tracks or any sign of a struggle. The consistency of the snow that morning was confirmed by the entire team, and no melting or drifting occurred that could have erased impressions within such a short window of time. Historical accounts from the region reveal similarly unusual stories told by local inhabitants who lived in the valleys long before modern mountaineering became common. Some early travellers wrote about sudden disappearances near bodies of high-altitude water, describing how thin air and rapidly shifting fogs could create momentary veils that disoriented even seasoned herders. Others mentioned old beliefs that lakes in the high Andes hold unusual acoustic properties because of the steep rock walls that surround them, though these accounts remain more contextual than explanatory. Archaeological surveys conducted throughout nearby passes have uncovered remnants of ancient trails used by Inca messengers crossing between valleys, suggesting that people once moved through the region with familiarity, yet none of the recorded histories reference a lake where travellers vanished without a trace. In the months following the disappearance, investigators reviewed equipment logs, weather data, and photographic records to ensure no detail had been overlooked. Temperatures that morning remained stable, and no seismic activity was recorded that could have destabilized shoreline rocks. The climber's gear remained in perfect condition at camp, and nothing suggested he'd intentionally left behind essential items. His companions reported no changes in behavior or mood, and journals recovered from the campsite indicated a routine expedition, with no discussion of unexplained occurrences in the nights leading up to the event. Although some members recalled hearing faint echoes after dark, they attributed these to shifting ice or distant avalanches, both common in the high Andes. Through interviews conducted long after the incident, a pattern emerged in one aspect of testimony. Nearly every witness recalled the silence near the lake that morning, a silence described with unusual consistency, as though the air had become too still and the surrounding peaks had absorbed all sound. It was this silence that several individuals remembered most clearly, a quiet so complete that even the soft crunch of snow beneath boots seemed suspended above the ground. The atmosphere of the basin appeared unchanged when rescue teams arrived, yet many noted the same unnerving stillness. Although silence alone does not explain, it remains one of the few details that every person present described with almost identical language. What happened to the climber remains unresolved, as every investigation returned to those final steps in the snow and the cold, unmoving surface of Laguna del Inca, where the water concealed nothing yet seemed to swallow everything. The soundless avalanche of Aconcagua. High on the immense slopes of Aconcagua, shifting bands of morning light revealed subtle movements across the snow that hinted at the strange, soundless avalanche later witnessed by climbers below. The highest mountain outside the Himalayas often greets dawn with fierce gusts sweeping along its ridges, yet that morning carried an unusual clarity that allowed distant details to stand out against the towering south face. Climbers on several routes remarked that the air felt sharply cold but oddly calm, a stillness that seemed to hang above the valley floor, while thin veils of ice crystals drifted without direction. It was within this quiet atmosphere that the massive sheet of snow began to rip away from the upper slopes, creating a cascade large enough to be seen from camps miles below, but producing none of the reverberations expected from such a collapse. Far along the established routes that cut across the mountain's western flank, climbers paused mid-step as they watched a distant wall of snow shear away in complete silence. Ice blocks tumbled in rapid succession, breaking apart as they fell toward the base of the south face, each fragment glowing briefly in the early light before merging with the growing cloud of white. One climber later described the sight as deeply unsettling, not because of the avalanche itself, which was a familiar hazard on Aconcagua, but because the surrounding air remained undisturbed by even the faintest tremor. Snow plumes spread outward like rising breath from the frozen ground, expanding in slow arcs that could be clearly followed from afar. Many instinctively braced for the delayed roar that usually follows such collapses, but the mountain gave nothing back except an unnerving stillness. Avalanches on Aconcagua are known for explosive echoes that roll through the valleys, yet the physics of those powerful sounds only deepened confusion after the silent collapse unfolded. Even moderate slides produce resonant booms that travel well beyond the immediate slopes due to the steep rock walls, forming natural acoustic channels. Larger events, such as those triggered by seracs breaking off the south face, are typically heard long before they're seen, their echoes ricocheting off the basin and carrying across multiple ridges. This expectation is ingrained in both novice and experienced climbers because the noise often serves as an early warning. That the avalanche on this particular morning generated no detectable sound ran counter to everything known about the mountain's acoustic behaviour. Down at the lower camps where tents lined the gravel plains, groups of mountaineers looked toward the south face and saw white plumes rising like smoke without hearing the expected thunder. Plaza de Mulas, the busiest base camp on the mountain, sits in a broad valley where sounds of falling rock, shifting ice and distant avalanches routinely travel with amplified clarity. This location allows climbers to track conditions high above them through sound alone, yet the large collapse observed that morning gave them no auditory cue to interpret. Some climbers emerged from their tents confused, uncertain if what they saw was an illusion caused by the glare of sunlight on drifting spindrift. Others climbed onto rock outcrops and strained to listen, but the valley remained strikingly quiet. Aconcagua's vast concave basin, shaped by centuries of ice movement and erosion, typically magnifies even faint disturbances, making the absence of sound from such a force all the more perplexing. The south face, notorious among mountaineers for its extreme vertical relief and unstable snowpack, funnels noise downwards with unusual intensity, producing echoes that linger far longer than on more open terrain. Geological surveys have noted that its layered composition of volcanic stone and compacted sediment reflects sound efficiently, creating a natural amphitheatre effect. Under ordinary conditions, even a small slab fracture on the face produces enough vibration to be heard from lower elevations. The silent avalanche defied not only experience, but the natural acoustics formed by the mountain itself. Weather records from that morning showed calm air, clear sky, and no atmospheric anomalies that could have muffled the roar of a mass of falling snow. Meteorologists monitoring the region reported stable temperatures overnight and no evidence of temperature inversions strong enough to distort sound on such a scale. Wind patterns remained gentle, with none of the violent gusts associated with the viento blanco, the fierce white wind known for disrupting climbs and carrying sound unpredictably. Sound dampening conditions typically require heavy snowfall, dense fog, or thick cloud cover, none of which were present. Instead, visibility remained excellent, and every visual detail of the avalanche could be observed with unusual clarity, reinforcing the mystery of its silence. When climbers finally reached the debris field, they found a hardened cone of compacted snow and shattered ice that bore every visual sign of a violent collapse except the auditory one. The impact zone stretched across a wide area, marked by deep troughs and scattered fragments of ice that had clearly fallen at high velocity. Snow had piled in ridges that indicated multiple waves of collapse rather than a single event, suggesting that the noise should have been even more substantial. No evidence showed that the snow had melted or softened before impact, ruling out the possibility of a slow, dampened descent. Everything about the scene pointed to a high-energy avalanche of the kind that typically announces itself with unmistakable force. Attempts to explain the silence ranged from temperature inversions to unusual snow layering, but none of the proposed ideas aligned with the scale of the event witnessed that day. Temperature inversions can trap sound close to the ground or direct it upward, but such effects usually distort sound rather than erase it. Unusual bonding within the snowpack might reduce internal fractures, yet the visible break lines showed clear signs of brittle failure. Some speculated that simultaneous small collapses might have occurred in different sections of the face, dispersing the usual shock wave, but the debris pattern suggested a single large event rather than numerous scattered ones. None of the available theories offered a coherent explanation. Seasoned guides who had spent years studying Aconcagua's temperamental slopes remarked that not one of them had encountered an avalanche that behaved with such quiet intensity. Their experiences ranged across dozens of climbing seasons, countless storms, and numerous shifts in weather patterns, yet the phenomenon remained unique. Many recalled nights when distant avalanches shook the ground beneath their tents, or when falling seracs cracked loudly enough to be mistaken for thunder. These testimonies underscored the strangeness of the silent collapse, not only because of its size, but because it contradicted every known pattern of the mountain's behaviour. Even after investigators pieced together every available observation, the unanswered gap between what was seen and what was heard continued to overshadow all practical explanations. Reports were compiled, conditions were re-examined, and the mountain was revisited by teams searching for geological clues, yet no data clarified how such a massive event could leave behind no sound for those who witnessed it with such clarity. Long after the snow settled into the contours of the valley, the memory of that silent collapse remained as unsettling as the mountain's refusal to offer any explanation for it. The vanished caravan of Paso de los Patos. Rumours preserved in scattered regional records first drew attention to a caravan that vanished along the Paso de los Patos route, under circumstances that no subsequent investigation has been able to clarify. The caravan was reported as moving with a routine familiarity, carrying supplies and pack animals accustomed to the harsh rhythms of the high Andes. Witnesses from nearby settlements recalled seeing the trailing group depart in orderly lines, their progress noted in official transport logs, yet the records abruptly cease without explanation. Paso de los Patos, a narrow corridor linking valleys in Argentina and Chile, had long been a conduit for trade, migration and military movements. Its steep slopes and exposed ridges were familiar to those who travelled it for decades, yet the disappearance of this caravan introduced a puzzle that could not be reconciled with geography, climate or known hazards. Despite careful planning, the travellers were never heard from again, leaving only faint traces in the official documents and the occasional indistinct memory from local inhabitants. The pass itself, long used as a strategic corridor between valleys, is deceptively direct, marked by trails that travellers for generations have relied upon to navigate its barren stretches. Its arid slopes are interspersed with wind-sculpted ridges and shallow ravines that channel small streams from the high peaks above. Observers have noted that the terrain, while unforgiving, provides sufficient visibility to monitor movement across its length. Travellers familiar with the route relied on both landmarks and consistent paths etched into the mountainsides. Yet the caravan's disappearance occurred precisely in an area where observation and terrain control should have rendered total vanishing impossible, deepening the mystery. The normally reliable topography offered no hints, leaving those retracing the caravan's journey with little more than speculation and faint impressions that had survived wind and erosion. Examining military and transport logbooks from nearby settlements reveals conflicting notes on dates, supplies, and the caravan's intended pace, leaving historians puzzled. Official records indicate that the caravan departed fully provisioned, with enough grain and equipment to traverse the high corridor safely. Other entries, however, suggest delays and minor disputes over pack animal distribution, hinting at ordinary logistical problems rather than anything extraordinary. Yet the timeline contradicts what later searchers discovered along the pass, where no trace of the caravan could be found for several kilometres. In some reports, patrols recorded distant signals that were never explained, perhaps misinterpreted echoes of animal movement or wind through the ridges, but no evidence connected these anomalies to the caravan. The resulting patchwork of documents presents a fragmented narrative that confirms the caravan existed, but offers no clarity on its fate. Years after the disappearance, scattered physical remnants appeared along hidden ravines, including warped wooden pack frames and fragments of coarse fabric, offering the only tangible traces of the caravan's passage. These items, partially buried under layers of windblown soil and small rock slides, suggested movement had occurred but left almost no evidence of the travellers themselves. Some pack frames showed signs of stress, perhaps from steep inclines or heavy loads, yet none were linked to injuries or human remains. Observers recorded footprints that were unusually spaced and occasionally vanished into areas where the terrain should have left impressions, a puzzle that defied explanation. Even the fabric remnants stiffened and frayed by exposure to sun and frost could not be definitively associated with a particular animal or traveller. Each trace reinforced the eerie reality. The caravan had moved through the pass and then simply disappeared. The corridor's microclimates, prone to abrupt winds and sudden temperature shifts, could explain some disorientation but failed to account for the complete lack of footprints or followable trail. Katabatic gusts sweep from the high slopes, shifting loose gravel and snow, yet experienced travellers know how to mitigate these effects with careful navigation. Temperature gradients across ridges can create mirages and distort distances, but no visual illusion alone could erase a caravan's presence. Local meteorological records indicate clear weather during the days of the disappearance, with calm winds and stable air, eliminating most natural explanations for why neither the caravan nor its animals left continuous evidence. Even considering the pass's microclimate, there remains an unexplainable gap between what the terrain could conceal and the complete absence of living traces along a route well travelled and historically monitored. Reconstructing the caravan's potential paths reveals an unsettling paradox. Every plausible route contradicts some portion of the surviving evidence. If the travellers remained on the main trail, they should have left tracks leading toward lower valleys, yet none appear. Deviations into side ravines would have provided cover, but would also have left material evidence, as some items were later discovered in areas inconsistent with that path. Estimates based on pace and terrain suggest that the caravan should have taken several hours to clear the most exposed sections, yet all footprints vanish long before they could have reached the farthest known markers. The absence of human or animal tracks in combination with scattered remnants implies an interruption or redirection of movement that defies normal understanding, leaving the entire passage shrouded in uncertainty. Earlier historical crossings, including detachments during the Andean independence campaigns, documented how even seasoned travellers could lose track of one another in moments, yet no previous record describes a complete disappearance like this. Military detachments occasionally reported miscommunications, delayed arrivals or temporary separations along Paso de los Patos, which were resolved within hours or days. Those historical accounts highlight the past's capacity for confusion and error, emphasising that experienced travellers can encounter extreme risk even under careful supervision. However, the total vanishing of an entire caravan without leaving survivors, bodies or continuous tracks exceeds known patterns. The event remains unmatched in documented history, a reminder that the Andes can harbour circumstances that challenge every expectation grounded in prior experience. In the end, the story remains suspended between documented fact and the persistent suggestion that the mountains themselves withheld the truth. Modern researchers, historians and geographers have combed through archives, examined the terrain, and retraced the most plausible routes, yet the caravan's disappearance remains unsolved. The combination of scattered physical traces, environmental challenges, and contradictory archival accounts creates a tapestry of uncertainty that resists definitive interpretation. Even contemporary travellers passing through the corridor speak quietly of the vanished caravan, aware that the pass may conceal more than simple topography or microclimate. For now, Paso de los Patos continues to hold its secret in silence, a passage that both documents and erases human endeavour in equal measure. Somewhere along that stark, open passage, the record of an ordinary journey slipped into silence that no map has ever been able to trace. The lights over Nevado Huascarán. Reports collected from climbers and base camp personnel first drew attention to mysterious lights over Nevado Huascarán, strange illuminations that appeared with no discernible source or explanation. Witnesses described them as orbs, flickering along the glacier lines or hovering over ridges where no human presence could be detected. Some appeared to move deliberately, weaving across crevasses and reflecting off snowfields with colours that ranged from pale blue to orange, while others glimmered in a steady, unwavering glow. The phenomenon was first noted during routine evening checks at high camps, where climbers scanning the southern slopes spotted lights that did not correspond to headlamps, flares, or any known equipment. Even those who had spent years navigating the Cordillera Blanca, familiar with its unpredictable weather and optical quirks, recognized that these displays did not match any natural pattern they had previously encountered. The repeated appearance of the lights, their duration, and the precision of their movement quickly elevated the incident from curiosity to a phenomenon warranting investigation. The mountain's glaciers and high snowfields can produce unusual reflections and optical effects, yet the observed lights persisted well into the night and through thin layers of cloud that should have dispersed any ordinary glow. Huascarán's expansive icefields are known to refract moonlight or sunlight in fleeting ways, sometimes producing mirages or shimmering streaks that vanish as the observer adjusts position. These effects, while visually striking, are usually brief and dependent on very specific angles. In contrast, the lights over Huascarán appeared repeatedly, for hours at a time, maintaining consistent movement and brightness. Observers noted that the illumination remained visible even as the clouds shifted, and at times lights emerged in areas shielded from any natural reflection, defying conventional explanation. The persistence and placement of these lights suggested an anomaly not easily accounted for by standard glacial or meteorological phenomena. Villagers in the surrounding valleys independently recalled seeing luminous shapes hovering above the peaks, often describing colours, movement patterns and timing that closely matched reports from climbers higher on the slopes. Families tending livestock or returning from distant trails noted lights that glided above the ice with a fluid motion, sometimes disappearing behind a ridge only to reappear moments later. Oral histories recorded by local researchers recount similar sightings decades earlier, describing glowing points that moved like spirits of the mountains and resisted observation for extended periods. While some dismissed these as folklore, the consistency of accounts across generations and elevations indicated a recurring phenomenon that had persisted despite changes in observation methods, technology, and human presence in the region. Examination of known atmospheric phenomena, including ice crystal refraction, auroras, and high-altitude electrical activity, offers only partial explanations, as the lights defied predictability and consistency. Auroral activity, while sometimes visible at these latitudes, rarely manifests as concentrated points of light travelling along defined paths. Electrical discharges or transient luminous events can occur at high elevations, but these are typically momentary flashes rather than sustained orbs capable of movement and colour variation. Even rare optical effects produced by ice crystals, such as halos or light pillars, cannot explain the apparent mobility, repetition and directional shifts observed over Huascarán. Scientists studying these reports acknowledge the possibility of unknown atmospheric interactions, yet the precise nature of the lights remains elusive, a puzzle at the intersection of perception and unexplained natural law. Early surveys and expedition reports mention unexplained glows over Huascarán, with some accounts preserved in local oral histories that describe similar luminous phenomena long before modern observations. Surveyors mapping the Cordillera Blanca in the late 19th and early 20th centuries occasionally noted distant lights on high ridges, often attributing them to campfires or equipment left by previous parties. Indigenous chroniclers spoke of mysterious flames or glimmers above the glaciers, often linking them to ancestral spirits or warnings of natural danger. While early observers lacked the tools to document these lights scientifically, the repeated references in multiple sources suggest a continuity that bridges centuries. The phenomenon has therefore become not only a modern curiosity, but part of a longer historical record, hinting at a mystery that transcends contemporary understanding. Witnesses often described disorienting effects, noting that the lights appeared to alter their perception of distance and slope, making familiar ridges and crevasses appear distorted and uncertain. Climbers attempting to navigate the southern icefields reported hesitation and misjudged footing, attributing it to the unusual illumination shifting visual references. Even with maps, GPS and clear skies, observers felt as though the lights reframed the landscape, exaggerating the steepness of slopes or masking crevasse edges. Researchers in perception and high-altitude cognition suggest that low-light visual anomalies can magnify existing spatial distortions, yet the uniformity and repetition of the light behaviour indicate a phenomenon that exceeds ordinary optical illusion, creating both awe and unease in those who encounter it. Though cameras, drones and scientific equipment were deployed, attempts frequently failed, producing only fleeting anomalies, while eyewitnesses insist that the phenomenon was far more vivid than any recorded image. High-resolution time-lapse cameras placed along the base and mid-slopes sometimes captured faint glimmers or streaks, yet these recordings lacked the intensity, movement, and colour described by witnesses. Drone footage occasionally revealed points of illumination that faded before close inspection, and infrared instruments detected minor thermal anomalies inconsistent with natural sources. These repeated failures to document the phenomenon fully have reinforced its enigmatic quality, highlighting a discrepancy between technological observation and human perception that only deepens the mystery. Despite repeated observation, documentation, and scientific inquiry, the lights continue to resist explanation, maintaining their presence over Huascarán as a phenomenon that challenges both experience and theory. Researchers, mountaineers, and local inhabitants alike have reported the lights over decades, yet no single model, meteorological, optical, or otherwise, has accounted for the full spectrum of behaviour. Huascarán, already a peak of formidable elevation and glacial complexity, seems to harbour this subtle yet persistent anomaly above its icy summits. The phenomenon remains, as it always has, both compelling and inexplicable, a reminder that the Andes still conceal secrets that challenge human understanding. Even when the stars fade and the mountain slopes grow silent, those lights linger in memory, as if Huascarán itself refuses to reveal the secret of what truly moves above its icy summits. The silent camp at Cerro Tupungato. The camp on Cerro Tupungato had been prepared with meticulous care, yet when the climbers awoke, the expected sounds of life and movement were nowhere to be heard, replaced by a profound and inexplicable stillness. Tents that should have rustled with the wind were eerily motionless, and the distant groan of shifting ice, usually a familiar backdrop, had vanished entirely. Morning routines proceeded under a heavy, unnatural quiet, with climbers exchanging uneasy glances as if the absence of ordinary noise carried its own warning. Equipment set out for the day remained undisturbed, and pack animals appeared calm but unresponsive, adding to the mounting sense of anomaly. Even seasoned mountaineers accustomed to the unpredictable conditions of the Andes recognized that this silence was not merely a quirk of wind or frost, it was something that defied normal understanding. The quiet stretched across the camp like a tangible force, shaping perception and compelling the team to move cautiously, aware that the mountain's usual rhythms had inexplicably paused. Under normal conditions, the camp buzzed with the routines of climbers, tents flapping in the wind, distant ice cracking along the slopes, and the steady shuffle of pack animals and equipment. Each morning began with a predictable cadence of activity, from the clatter of cookware to the movement of climbers organizing gear for ascents. The terrain, while harsh and at high altitude, typically offered a symphony of environmental sounds, signaling the passage of time and confirming that life persisted in the thin air. Even the faint echoes of distant avalanches or shifting glaciers provided reassurance, serving as natural markers that oriented climbers to the rhythm of the mountain. This usual soundtrack was absent at Cerro Tupungato, leaving the camp suspended in a strange temporal vacuum where every second of silence felt extended and oppressive. The contrast between expected sounds and their absence intensified the team's unease, making the familiar terrain feel subtly altered. It was during the early morning that the absence became most noticeable. The familiar chorus of environmental and human activity replaced by a hollow silence that unsettled even the most seasoned team members. Breakfast routines were performed with an almost mechanical precision, yet the absence of normal auditory feedback, dogs whining, packs shifting, boots scraping gravel, made each motion feel amplified and exposed. Conversations between climbers were hushed, not by order but by instinct, as though the mountain itself demanded caution in response to the unnatural stillness. Even the wind seemed stilled in patches, moving inconsistently across ridges and ice fields, creating pockets of quiet so deep that the usual sense of spatial awareness faltered. As they looked across the slopes, climbers reported a sensation that the entire environment had entered a state of pause, a condition that could not be explained by any natural occurrence familiar to them. The expedition reacted with careful observation, checking each tent, scanning the slopes, and logging the anomaly in detail, noting how nothing appeared disturbed despite the extended quiet. Logs recorded exact times, weather readings, and the apparent absence of usual animal activity. Radios, normally crackling with static or brief messages, transmitted silence across channels. Team members climbed small ridges to look down at the camp from a distance, expecting to see movement or signs of wildlife, but the scene remained perfectly still. The meticulous documentation was intended to rule out ordinary explanations, yet the absence of disturbance persisted in a way that defied both experience and expectation. Every check confirmed the same anomaly. Life at the camp existed, yet its usual markers, sound, movement and response, were absent, leaving the climbers with a tension that intensified with each passing hour. Specialists in high-altitude meteorology note that temperature inversions, wind shifts or glacial acoustics can dampen sound, yet none of these explanations could account for the prolonged and uniform stillness observed across the entire camp. Inversions might muffle distant noises, and shifting snow or ice can absorb or distort sound waves, but these effects are usually uneven and localized. At Cerro Tupungato, readings indicated a standard temperature gradient, moderate winds and clear air conditions. Acoustic anomalies caused by glacial formations would normally produce echoes or unexpected reverberations, yet the silence was absolute and consistent. Even when accounting for altitude-related changes in sound propagation, the uniformity of quiet across the camp and surrounding slopes remained inexplicable. Experts reviewing the logs concluded that the anomaly did not correspond to any known acoustic or meteorological phenomenon, leaving the team with a lingering sense of unease. Explorers' notes and historical records describe intermittent but unexplained silences, hinting that Cerro Tupungato has long been the site of subtle environmental anomalies that resist ordinary explanation. Diaries from climbers in the early 20th century mention moments when the usual mountain sounds ceased abruptly, creating a disorienting effect similar to that reported by the current expedition. Indigenous oral histories speak of the mountain holding its breath at times, describing intervals of profound stillness in areas otherwise bustling with wind and wildlife. These narratives, while varied in detail, converge on a consistent observation. Cerro Tupungato occasionally enters periods where natural auditory cues vanish entirely, producing a phenomenon that is as unsettling as it is enigmatic. The persistence of such accounts across decades adds weight to the climber's experience, suggesting a recurring anomaly rather than a single unusual event. Climbers reported an unsettling effect on perception and decision-making, a phenomenon partially explained by altitude-related cognitive changes, yet the silence intensified the sense of isolation beyond what physiology alone could account for. Spatial awareness faltered when the usual environmental cues were missing. Distances appeared skewed, and the slopes seemed both nearer and farther than they actually were. Conversations felt muted, gestures exaggerated, and the passage of time appeared slowed. Even when performing familiar tasks, setting up equipment or traversing ice fields, the team experienced a heightened sense of caution and hyper-awareness, as though the silence itself imposed psychological weight. While high-altitude cognition can explain some disorientation, the precise nature and persistence of the anomaly suggested an external influence on perception, a subtle pressure woven into the fabric of the camp's environment. After meticulous observation, repeated measurement, and thorough documentation, the source of the silence remained unidentifiable, leaving the camp suspended in an inexplicable calm that defied reason. Every attempt to provoke sound, from shouting to striking metal surfaces, produced echoes that seemed muted or delayed, as if absorbed by the mountain itself. Environmental sensors registered no anomalies in wind, temperature, or pressure that could account for the phenomenon. Night fell with the same pervasive quiet, and even the movement of distant glaciers, usually audible from the base camp, seemed muted. The climbers remained alert, knowing that Cerro Tupungato's harsh conditions required vigilance, yet the silence persisted as both a physical and psychological presence, unyielding and unexplainable. As daylight spread across the slopes, the quiet persisted, tangible and unyielding, as if Cerro Tupungato itself had absorbed all sound and refused to release it back to the world. The frozen figures of Llullaillaco. Archaeologists ascending Llullaillaco first encountered the frozen figures, bodies so perfectly preserved that each detail of clothing, hair and expression remained visible after centuries atop the Andean summit. The initial impression was one of reverent awe. These were not simply remains, but glimpses of lives once lived under extraordinary circumstances. Each figure seemed to convey both solemnity and the eerie stillness of the high-altitude environment, as though frozen in the exact moment of their final breaths. The expedition carefully documented every observation before touching the mummies, aware that improper handling could destroy the fragile balance that had preserved them. Beyond their physical state, the figures seemed to carry an aura of mystery, silently posing questions about the rituals that brought them to this remote and unforgiving peak. Even seasoned archaeologists, accustomed to high-altitude discoveries, felt a chill from the combination of historical significance and the haunting perfection of preservation. The volcano's extreme altitude and thin, frigid air created conditions capable of naturally preserving organic matter, yet survival in such an environment remained improbable for living humans without modern equipment. Llullaillaco rises over 22,000 feet, where temperatures plummet far below freezing for most of the year, and oxygen levels are perilously low. Winds sweep across the slopes with relentless force, and snowfields extend for miles, making any prolonged human activity difficult and exhausting. In such a setting, decay processes slow dramatically, and biological material can remain intact for centuries. Yet even accounting for these factors, the remarkable state of preservation observed in the Llullaillaco mummies far exceeded what scientists typically encounter, suggesting that natural refrigeration alone could not explain the preservation of hair, skin, and delicate textiles. When the team carefully removed layers of ice and soil, the immediate sight of the mummies provoked both awe and unease, their postures and artifacts revealing ritual significance intertwined with an unnerving stillness. One figure lay with hands crossed over the chest, a tiny bundle of ceremonial objects at its side, while another was positioned with arms extended in a gesture interpreted as symbolic communication with the divine. The intact clothing bore intricate weaving patterns, dyed in colours that survived centuries in the extreme cold, and small figurines and offerings accompanied the bodies. Every detail seemed intentional, meticulously placed to adhere to religious practice and societal ritual, yet the circumstances surrounding their deaths remained obscure. The interplay of ritual precision and the silent altitude created a tension that was difficult to articulate, leaving the archaeologist both fascinated and unsettled. Each figure displayed remarkable preservation: soft hair, intact clothing woven from camelid fibers, and skin hardened but undistorted by decay, offering rare insight into Incan high-altitude ritual practices. Textiles were carefully examined, revealing dyes derived from local plants and minerals, and the craftsmanship reflected advanced weaving techniques for the time. Even the tiny objects placed with the mummies, small figurines, miniature tools, and ceramic offerings, remained intact, providing clues to their ceremonial purpose. Biological analysis confirmed that the mummies' bodies had undergone no significant microbial decay, a testament to the extreme environment's ability to suspend decomposition. For historians and scientists alike, the preservation offered an unprecedented window into a society that conducted ritual practices at the limits of human endurance and environmental possibility. Incan documents describe capacocha, the ritual of child sacrifice at sacred peaks, performed to honor deities and ensure community welfare, yet the reasons behind specific selections and the exact procedures remain partially speculative. Written accounts by Spanish chroniclers detail sacrifices that were elaborate and deeply symbolic, often conducted on mountain summits considered sacred. Children chosen for capacocha were typically from noble families, believed to possess purity and spiritual resonance that could appease gods and secure prosperity. While the broader practice is well documented, questions linger about the personal experiences of those chosen, how the ceremonies were conducted at extreme altitude, and what specific rituals accompanied each sacrifice. The Llullaillaco mummies provide concrete evidence, yet leave vast gaps in understanding, especially regarding the emotional and logistical aspects of such practices. Forensic analysis revealed details about diet, health, and subtle trauma, yet some findings puzzled scientists, including faint marks and artifacts whose functional symbolism could not be fully explained. Hair analysis suggested a diet rich in maize and protein sources, consistent with high-altitude Andean life, and dental examination revealed careful attention to hygiene and ritual adornment. Subtle bruising and evidence of blunt trauma hinted at the final moments of life, though the exact mechanisms remain debated. Items buried with the mummies included miniature tools and charms, whose purpose is still uncertain, and some physical anomalies resisted straightforward interpretation. Every forensic observation confirmed a high level of planning and ritualized intent, yet simultaneously deepened the mystery, raising as many questions as it answered. The discovery left archaeologists and local historians reflecting on the human experience encapsulated in these frozen figures, a blend of devotion, suffering, and ritual that transcends time while remaining hauntingly present. Observing the figures in situ offered an emotional connection rarely achieved in archaeological research, highlighting the interplay between human belief, mortality, and the unforgiving natural world. Local indigenous perspectives added further depth, connecting the mummies to ongoing traditions and spiritual narratives that survived the centuries. Researchers grappled with the tension between scientific analysis and the profound human story embedded in the frozen remains, understanding that the mummies were both subjects of study and enduring witnesses to a ritual culture. After extensive study and careful preservation, questions lingered. Why were these particular individuals chosen? How precisely did the ceremonies unfold, and how did their bodies remain so unaltered by centuries of exposure? Every artifact, every preserved feature provided tantalizing clues, yet resisted full interpretation. The extreme environment, cultural practices, and biological preservation intersected in ways that confounded simple explanation. Even as technological analysis advanced, the mummies continued to pose a challenge to understanding, blending the realms of science, history, and mystery. The summit of Llullaillaco remains a place where past and present converge, a testament to human ritual and the enduring enigma of the frozen figures. High atop Llullaillaco, the frozen figures endure as silent witnesses to a ritual world both meticulously structured and stubbornly unknowable, leaving the summit steeped in unresolved history and quiet wonder. The shadow crossing Punta de Vacas. A sudden dark shape appeared briefly across the narrow pass of Punta de Vacas, moving with a speed and purpose that left the travellers uncertain of what they had witnessed. The shadow emerged without warning, stretching from one jagged rock face to the other, then dissipating almost as quickly as it had formed. Those present could not determine whether it was a living creature, a figure of ice and snow, or an optical distortion amplified by the altitude and sun. Eyes strained against the bright glare reflecting off the surrounding glaciers, but even the most experienced climbers admitted they had never encountered anything resembling this phenomenon. The moment was so fleeting that documenting it required a balance of instinct and speed, yet the observers were compelled to record every detail: direction, timing, posture, and the uncanny fluidity of movement. Even seasoned guides, familiar with mountain illusions and the tricks of light on snow and stone, found themselves unsettled, aware that the pass had offered a glimpse of something defying easy explanation. The pass itself is carved between cliffs and jagged rock formations, where sunlight can create elongated shadows that shift dramatically with the movement of clouds and snow. Ice and frost clung to every crevice, reflecting light in fractured beams that could give the impression of motion where none existed. Narrow ledges and abrupt drops confined the observers' paths, intensifying the visual impact of any movement within the pass. The wind, gusting unpredictably through these natural channels, sometimes carried snow in thin veils, adding layers of transient shapes that could be mistaken for motion. The travellers were aware that perception at this altitude is fragile, with high contrast between light and shadow affecting depth and size judgment. Yet the shadow they saw maintained a coherence and direction inconsistent with ordinary optical illusions. Even against the challenging backdrop of the Andes, the figure's movement stood out as deliberate, measured, and almost conscious. Observers described the figure as fleeting, almost translucent in parts, its outline seeming to distort against the icy slopes as if the mountain itself bent the light. The shadow moved smoothly over terrain where no animal of comparable size or speed had ever been recorded, and the observers reported a sense of weightless motion, as though gravity and wind were subtly interacting with the form. The edges of the figure flickered against rock and ice, making it difficult to discern whether it was solid or ephemeral. Some suggested it resembled a human silhouette, though the proportions seemed altered, unnaturally elongated, or compressed depending on the angle of observation. The brief duration of visibility, mere seconds in a span of minutes, only heightened the ambiguity. Even after repeated glances in the same direction, nothing remained, leaving the mind to grapple with the boundary between reality and perception. Initial reactions ranged from astonishment to disbelief, with climbers and guides attempting to track the shadow's path, while questioning whether it was a trick of the eye or a real presence. Binoculars and cameras were trained on the region, yet even modern optical devices struggled to capture the form clearly. Shouts and gestures proved unnecessary, as the shadow did not respond to noise or motion. The observers noted an eerie sense of quiet accompanying the sighting, a muted backdrop against which the figure seemed more pronounced. Debate arose over whether wind patterns, snowdrifts, or sunlight reflected off ice crystals could produce such a coherent silhouette, but no natural explanation fit all observed characteristics. The moment became a test of both the senses and judgment, pushing the group to reconcile what they thought they knew about high-altitude landscapes with a reality that appeared to bend those rules. Optical phenomena, such as reflections from ice, snowdrifts, or distant boulders, could account for some visual distortions, yet the consistency of the shadow's movement challenged conventional explanation. Light can bend in unpredictable ways at extreme altitudes, creating illusions of motion or exaggerated shapes, but these effects typically lack directionality and repeatability. The shadow observed at Punta de Vacas seemed to traverse a clear path, with changes in posture and apparent speed that no static feature or simple reflection could account for. Scientists and mountaineers alike noted that altitude and thin air can distort perception of distance and velocity, yet even allowances for physiological effects could not reconcile the observer's testimony with conventional explanations. The interplay of terrain, lighting, and visual perception contributed to confusion, but the figure's presence remained anomalous in every recorded detail. Local legends speak of strange figures crossing the high Andes, and although many remain anecdotal, occasional reports echo the precise timing and location of the Punta de Vacas sighting. Stories passed down among travelers and indigenous communities tell of ephemeral silhouettes that appear at the edge of passes, disappearing when approached. Some link these accounts to spirits or guardians of the mountains, while others suggest meteorological or optical anomalies observed over generations. The convergence of folklore and contemporary observation does not prove supernatural origin, yet it emphasizes that this pass has long been associated with unexplained visual phenomena. For the climbers witnessing the shadow, these stories added weight to their experience, suggesting that the pass has long been a stage for fleeting, enigmatic events. High-altitude conditions can affect perception, slowing reaction times and altering visual acuity, yet the observers were seasoned mountaineers familiar with the region's tricks of light and terrain. Fatigue, low oxygen and cold can produce hallucinations or misinterpretation of stimuli, but these factors would generally distort rather than create coherent, directional movement. The climbers' careful attention and rapid documentation helped minimize errors, and their shared observations provide a rare convergence of independent accounts. Psychological factors may have heightened the sense of urgency and focus, but the group repeatedly emphasized that the figure maintained a form and trajectory beyond what could be easily explained by high-altitude effects alone. Their testimony reflects both human vulnerability and resilience in perceiving the extreme environment. Even after hours of observation and detailed documentation, the shadow's origin remained unresolved, leaving the group with the unsettling sense that the pass had momentarily revealed something beyond ordinary understanding. Equipment and natural markers provided no clues, and no subsequent movement suggested that any animal or human could have caused the sighting. Each attempt to recreate conditions failed to reproduce the phenomenon, cementing the encounter as a singular mysterious event. The ambiguity persisted, challenging assumptions about perception, environment, and the interaction between them. Observers were left with a quiet tension, aware that the shadow had passed, yet its presence lingered in memory and imagination. The figure had vanished as quickly as it appeared, yet the memory of its passage lingered, a silent question etched across the slopes of Punta de Vacas. The black mist of Cordillera Blanca. Travelers stumbled blindly through the high valleys of Cordillera Blanca when an unnerving black mist appeared, its presence immediately triggering fear and confusion among the group. One moment the path ahead seemed clear, and the next, a dense darkness enveloped them, swallowing both sight and sound. The mist moved with an unnatural swiftness, filling the valleys with a creeping shadow that seemed to follow, then overtake the traveller's every step. Shouts echoed faintly, muted almost immediately, leaving a sense of isolation that intensified with each heartbeat. Even experienced climbers, accustomed to sudden weather changes in the Andes, admitted the experience defied ordinary explanation. Their equipment, compasses, altimeters and cameras functioned without obvious malfunction, yet perception itself faltered, as if the mist reached beyond the body to distort thought and balance. With every hesitant step, the travellers felt the weight of uncertainty pressing against the bones and nerves, the mountains themselves seeming to hold their breath in anticipation. The surrounding peaks and glaciers created a labyrinth of cliffs and shadowed crevices, where sudden temperature drops and swirling winds could turn ordinary fog into something far more unsettling. Ice-capped ridges reflected limited light in fractured patterns, making distance difficult to judge, while glaciers shifted subtly beneath the faint wind, producing fleeting illusions of movement. Valleys narrowed unexpectedly, forcing the group to weave along ledges barely wide enough for a single footstep. Wind gusts carried fine snow in irregular sheets, momentarily concealing drops and fissures. The terrain demanded careful navigation, but the black mist rendered the familiar strange, transforming simple crevices into potential threats. In such a place, even minor disorientation could become dangerous, yet the mist seemed to exist independently of the terrain, moving in ways that no observer could predict or fully understand. As the mist thickened, every step became a challenge, and the climbers struggled to distinguish familiar paths from the distorted shadows that loomed just beyond reach. Rocks, previously identifiable by shape and colour, appeared as shifting silhouettes, their edges wavering like smoke. Sounds were absorbed into the dense veil, footsteps muffled and distant riverbeds nearly imperceptible. One climber swore he glimpsed a figure briefly reflected against a rock face, only to see it vanish when he turned to focus. The mist seemed capable of altering perception itself, forcing the mind to reconcile impossible contradictions, solidity that felt fluid, a distance that appeared simultaneously near and far. Even the most practiced eyes and instincts failed to provide reliable guidance, and the group found themselves advancing cautiously, one hand along the cliff wall, one foot searching for solid ground. Pack animals refused to move, and the group's sense of direction faltered, forcing them to rely on intuition and instinct rather than sight or sound. Llamas and mules stamped and shifted uneasily, eyes wide, ears twitching at stimuli unseen by human companions. Their reluctance heightened the traveller's anxiety, as the animal's instincts often surpass human understanding of the environmental cues. Guides attempted to calm the animals, whispering commands and offering gentle prods, but the mist seemed to amplify every hesitation. Even subtle changes in slope or wind direction were exaggerated in perception, and the normal rhythm of travel dissolved into a cautious, deliberate crawl. The group became acutely aware of the thin oxygen at this altitude, the racing pulse and rapid breathing making every second feel drawn out, stretching time as the black veil persisted. Amid the opaque veil, shifting shapes seemed to appear and vanish, accompanied by subtle noises that could not be traced to any natural source. Small rocks tumbled from unseen ledges, or so it seemed, but no evidence remained once the mist cleared. Faint silhouettes suggested movement beyond the immediate line of sight, and distant whispers of sound raised the question of whether the mist itself carried echoes or if imagination had begun to mingle with reality. Even in moments of silence, the sense of being observed persisted, as though the mist contained awareness. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, then collapsed, leaving spaces that felt hollow and distorted. Every attempt to rationalize the shapes encountered more inconsistencies, heightening the tension and the feeling that the mountains had been transformed into a place governed by their own mysterious rules. Local folklore describes similar occurrences, where dense, shadowy mists sweep through the mountains, leaving those caught within them with heightened fear and strange impressions. Indigenous stories speak of spirits residing in glacial valleys, occasionally manifesting as darkness that obscures and tests those who traverse sacred paths. While these tales are often symbolic, their recurrence in multiple accounts over generations suggests that strange, enveloping mists have long been a part of Andean life. Travellers and guides recounted hearing stories from ancestors, warning against lingering in certain high passes during sudden weather changes. Such narratives do not fully explain the black mist, yet they add historical resonance to the experience, reinforcing that this phenomenon is woven into the cultural memory of Cordillera Blanca. While scientists note that rare atmospheric phenomena can produce dense, low-lying clouds or dust-laden winds, these factors do not explain the mist's unusual behaviour or its effects on humans and animals. Orographic clouds form when moist air rises and cools, and local winds can carry volcanic or glacial dust, creating temporary haze. Yet these natural processes rarely account for the sudden density, the seemingly purposeful movement of the mist, or the profound psychological effects reported by witnesses. Temperature drops and sudden visibility loss might contribute to disorientation, but the consistency and timing observed suggest an element beyond ordinary meteorology. Researchers studying the area have concluded that while some features can be modelled or reproduced, the full experience, including the shifting shapes, auditory anomalies and animals' reactions, remains unexplained. A prolonged period of careful observation failed to explain the black mist, leaving the observers with a persistent sense of unease and unanswered questions about its origin and nature. Equipment recorded only fragments, faint variations in light intensity, minor fluctuations in temperature, and sporadic wind gusts that could not fully account for the perception of movement within the mist. Human testimony remained the primary record, capturing the combination of fear, disorientation, and awe. The travellers knew they had encountered something that stretched the limits of understanding, a phenomenon at the intersection of natural forces and something far more enigmatic. As the mist slowly dispersed, revealing the familiar slopes of Cordillera Blanca once again, the sense of having crossed an invisible threshold lingered, leaving a shadow of uncertainty that could not be erased. Though it dispersed as quickly as it arrived, the memory of the black mist lingered over Cordillera Blanca, a reminder that some Andean mysteries remain untouchable. The echo anomaly at Cajón del Maipo. A sudden, inexplicable repetition of sound startled the hikers as they navigated the narrow walls of Cajón del Maipo, each echo returning in unexpected tones and intervals. One moment, a shout seemed ordinary, meant to signal or communicate, and the next, it returned warped, multiplied, or delayed in ways that defied expectation. The hikers paused, uncertain whether the echoes were the result of natural acoustics or something more mysterious. Even experienced climbers, familiar with the canyon's tendencies to amplify sounds, admitted the phenomena went beyond what they had ever encountered. Each call was answered almost immediately, yet not from the direction of origin, leaving the group disoriented and alert. Instruments like compasses and altimeters remained functional, but perception itself faltered. With every repeated sound, a creeping unease spread, as though the canyon had taken control of time and space, folding the ordinary laws of acoustics into something unrecognizable. The canyon's towering rock faces and tightly enclosed channels create a natural amphitheater, where sound can bounce in ways that both amplify and distort familiar noises. Vertical cliffs rise sharply on either side, forcing riverbeds and narrow trails into confined spaces where echoes are unavoidable. Sunlight glints off jagged rock, but the real spectacle is auditory, as every footstep, shout, or snapping twig can ricochet multiple times, creating a layered effect. Seasonal snow and ice can further alter acoustics, reflecting sound in unpredictable directions. In such a tightly constrained environment, even the faintest noises can produce a symphony of echoes, yet the anomaly at Cajón del Maipo consistently displayed behaviour that defied these ordinary explanations. The canyon itself seemed to manipulate the echoes, elongating some, suppressing others, and producing tones that had no apparent source. One climber's shout, intended to alert companions, returned moments later with a strange delay, warped pitch, and subtle tonal fluctuations that seemed almost deliberate. The sound did not simply echo off the nearest wall, but appeared to originate from a location both distant and impossible to identify. Footsteps and hand claps similarly transformed as they reverberated through the canyon, creating the illusion that multiple presences occupied the space. The travellers exchanged uneasy glances, realising that the auditory experience could not be predicted. The delay and distortion were inconsistent yet persistent, suggesting an interaction between the natural terrain and some unrecognised factor. Even attempts to produce rhythmic noises yielded unpredictable outcomes, making navigation and coordination increasingly difficult. In trying to identify the source of each echo, observers grew increasingly frustrated, as sounds appeared to emerge from impossible directions and distances. Calls that should have been straightforward returned from behind boulders, over cliffs, or from points that were physically inaccessible. The hikers tried triangulation, shouting sequentially and marking positions, but the echoes continued to defy logic. The unpredictability created tension, as each sound prompted immediate but uncertain reactions. Some companions felt compelled to remain silent, hoping the canyon would settle, while others tested the phenomenon by generating loud, deliberate noises, only to find them distorted in ways that heightened disorientation. The canyon, it seemed, had a will of its own, responding with a logic invisible to human senses. During their passage, the anomaly escalated. Voices doubled or split, claps produced overlapping reverberations, and certain tones seemed to linger while others vanished entirely. Even familiar sounds, like the rustle of a backpack or the creak of a climbing harness, became distorted, producing phantom noises that suggested movement where none existed. The layering of echoes created confusion over distance and direction, compelling the hikers to move cautiously and check each step multiple times. The experience took a psychological toll, blending fear with fascination and challenging assumptions about the reliability of human perception in extreme terrain. Each anomalous echo became a test of patience and judgment, a reminder that the canyon's rules were unlike those outside its walls. Local guides and elders recount past reports of unusual echoes in the canyon, some describing them as playful tricks of the mountain, others warning of the disorientation they can cause. Stories passed down through generations often speak of voices from unseen presences, or sounds that return as warnings to those unprepared for the terrain's challenges. Such accounts, though anecdotal, reinforce the sense that Cajón del Maipo has long been recognized for its acoustic peculiarities. Modern visitors occasionally confirm these reports, noting the same unpredictable behaviors documented by earlier travelers. The convergence of contemporary observation with historical accounts strengthens the impression that the canyon's anomalies are neither imagined nor isolated. Scientific studies acknowledge that narrow canyons can refract and delay sound, yet the timing, distortion, and apparent directionality of the echoes at Cajón del Maipo defy conventional acoustic explanation. Researchers note that sound travels differently in confined spaces, bending around corners and reflecting off hard surfaces, but the consistency and variety of the anomalies surpass what would be expected from these phenomena alone. Acoustic models predict multiple echoes, yet none can account for voices that split, distort, or appear to originate from locations physically impossible. The canyon's combination of narrow walls, jagged rocks, and intermittent water flows provides ideal conditions for sound manipulation. Yet human witnesses consistently report experiences that exceed theoretical predictions, suggesting an element that is at once natural and mysteriously unpredictable. No matter the attempts to measure or anticipate the phenomenon, the echoes retained their unpredictable nature, leaving witnesses with a persistent sense that the canyon itself was interacting with perception. Equipment could record only fragments, slight delays, amplitude variations, or faint reverberations, yet these failed to convey the full experience of hearing sounds twist, double, and shift in impossible ways. The psychological impact remained profound, as the mind struggled to reconcile what was heard with what was seen. Even after exiting the canyon, the hikers could recall the disorienting nature of each echo, the uncanny sense of movement in the absence of visual cues, and the realization that the canyon had imposed a subtle but undeniable influence on perception. These experiences lingered long after the last sound had faded, a haunting testament to the canyon's enigmatic power. When silence returned, the memory of voices bouncing impossibly across the rocks lingered, a reminder that some mountains guard mysteries that cannot be measured. The unmarked shelter on Nevado del Ruiz. The discovery of a small unmarked shelter on Nevado del Ruiz caught the climbers entirely by surprise, appearing as if it had emerged from the ice and rock overnight. One moment, they had been navigating familiar paths along creviced glaciers and volcanic scree, and the next, a rudimentary structure came into view, isolated and inexplicable. Its walls were rigid and intact, contrasting sharply with the harsh, erosive environment surrounding it. The team exchanged cautious glances, unsure whether the shelter was abandoned, deliberately concealed, or maintained by unknown visitors. Its sudden appearance raised immediate questions. Who had constructed such a refuge, and for what purpose? Even in the presence of modern mountaineering maps and guides, no record of the shelter existed, deepening the sense of mystery and intrigue. The harsh winds howled through the surrounding slopes, carrying fine volcanic dust that blurred sightlines, yet the shelter seemed untouched by time or weather in any ordinary sense. The mountain's glaciers and volcanic slopes create treacherous paths, with hidden crevices and unstable scree making every step a potential hazard for the unwary. Snowfields could conceal deep fissures, and jagged rocks often shifted underfoot, making deliberate movement essential. Streams of meltwater cut sharply into softer volcanic soil, creating channels that could trap or sweep away anyone who misjudged the terrain. At higher elevations, oxygen thinned and temperatures drop, placing climbers at greater risk of fatigue and disorientation. These factors amplify the significance of finding a man-made structure in such a location, as survival alone is a challenge on Nevado del Ruiz. The shelter's presence suggested that someone had successfully navigated these dangers, carrying materials and constructing walls in conditions that would deter most. Its existence alone testified to human determination or purpose beyond what the team could immediately comprehend. From a distance, the shelter looked almost rudimentary, yet closer inspection revealed careful construction, reinforced walls, and materials that seemed out of place in such an isolated environment. The exterior stones were tightly fitted, with wooden supports that appeared weathered but intentionally preserved. Evidence of insulation suggested awareness of extreme cold and wind, and small ventilation gaps indicated a practical understanding of airflow. Oddly, there were no markings or identifiers, no trace of government, scientific, or mountaineering insignia. Even the entrance, partially hidden behind a natural outcrop, seemed deliberately camouflaged. The juxtaposition of simplicity and sophistication puzzled the climbers, as the structure combined elements of survival pragmatism with a deliberate effort to remain unnoticed in an area rarely visited by humans. Entering the shelter, observers found traces of human activity, scattered equipment, weathered containers, and markings etched into the walls, though none explained the purpose or origin of the refuge. Small fire pits were present, blackened by soot yet showing no recent use, and personal items appeared abandoned, as if left in a hurry. Containers once holding food or water were partially preserved, their labels faded by time and volcanic exposure. Symbols scratched into the interior stone walls suggested navigation, dates, or possibly warnings, but none could be conclusively interpreted. No written records, maps, or modern instruments were found, leaving the team with only physical remnants to speculate upon. The interior felt strangely intimate, a confined space amid a vast wilderness, yet entirely detached from known human activity, producing both intrigue and unease. The team felt a mixture of curiosity and unease, aware that the altitude, cold, and volcanic conditions amplified both physical risk and the psychological weight of the unknown. Each moment spent examining the shelter required vigilance. One misstep could result in injury or worse. The silence surrounding the structure added to its enigma, as only the wind and the distant rumble of volcanic tremors broke the stillness. Hikers speculated quietly, aware that their own presence might be the first human encounter with the site in decades, or perhaps longer. Their minds wandered between plausible explanations and the uncanny possibility that the shelter existed for reasons beyond their understanding. Every gust of wind and shift of snow intensified the impression that the mountain itself was observing their intrusion. Historical accounts and local stories occasionally hint at hidden refuges or emergency shelters on Nevado del Ruiz, though no verified reports describe anything matching this discovery. Indigenous legends speak of hidden shelters used for temporary refuge during eruptions or blizzards, though these accounts remain vague and largely anecdotal. Early mountaineers documented emergency sites, but most were mapped and marked. Nothing suggested a deliberately concealed structure in such an inhospitable zone. The lack of records, combined with the remote location, fueled speculation that the shelter could predate modern mountaineering, or even be the work of clandestine visitors. Scholars and historians may debate origins, yet the physical evidence of human activity remains indisputable, presenting a tangible anomaly in an otherwise untamed environment. Researchers considered multiple explanations, from temporary emergency structures to abandoned scientific outposts, but the shelter's unmarked and remote placement defied practical logic. Scientific stations or emergency refuges are typically built in predictable locations, with documented coordinates and communication lines. This shelter lacked both. The team examined construction materials for clues. Timber and nails could have been sourced locally, yet the precision of assembly suggested skill and planning. Theories ranged from secret research teams, smuggling operations, or isolated survivalist endeavours, but each possibility clashed with the reality of transporting supplies through glaciers, scree and crevices at extreme altitudes. The practical challenges of building such a shelter underscore its mystery, raising questions about the intentions and capabilities of its builders. Once the group departed, the unanswered questions persisted. Who built the shelter, why it remained unmarked, and what role it played in the harsh environment of the mountain. Team members reflected on the improbability of encountering such a structure, recognizing the mixture of human ingenuity and secrecy it represented. The shelter offered no clear narrative, no explanation for its existence beyond the tangible evidence left behind. In the following days, discussions turned to theories, some plausible, some speculative, but all reinforced the sense that Nevado del Ruiz held secrets yet to be revealed. The landscape retained its power to surprise, reminding climbers and observers that the Andes are as much a keeper of mysteries as they are a challenge to traverse. The unmarked shelter endures as a silent enigma atop Nevado del Ruiz, a solitary monument to secrets the Andes have yet to reveal. The drifting footprints of Chimborazo. A heavy crystalline fog blanketed Chimborazo's upper slopes, muffling sound and making the glaciers appear endless and indistinct. The sun struggled to penetrate the mist, casting muted shadows across the ice, while each step forward threatened to sink into hidden crevasses or loose snow. Within this veil of white, the landscape seemed both infinite and claustrophobic, compressing distance and blurring the familiar landmarks that climbers relied upon. It was in this uncertain terrain that unusual marks began to draw attention, footprints etched into the glacier with precision, their origin and meaning immediately mysterious. Observers could not initially explain how the prints came to be, or why they appeared in areas nearly impossible for a human to traverse. Their presence, subtle yet deliberate, lent the mountain a silent, almost sentient quality, as if Chimborazo itself were testing those who dared ascend its frozen heights. Snowfields stretched in jagged expanses, broken only by the occasional crevasse or wind-sculpted ridge that challenged every step. The high altitude and thin air demanded careful navigation, making any movement across the glacier a test of endurance and skill. Each step left a visible imprint that quickly hardened in the cold, yet somehow the mysterious footprints defied ordinary tracking. They appeared in lines across ridges too narrow or icy for safe passage. Climbers noted the irregular spacing between the marks, and in some places impressions suggested a weight that exceeded a typical human. The glacier's ever-shifting surface made their permanence fleeting, and yet they maintained coherence over distances that should have erased them. The extreme environment emphasized the improbability of such tracks appearing naturally or accidentally. Footprints appeared along a narrow ridge, deep and measured, tracing a path that seemed improbable given the unstable terrain and high altitude. Observers compared the impressions to known boot sizes, finding them largely consistent with human footwear, yet no expedition claimed ownership of the tracks. Some prints angled toward precipices or areas of fractured ice, suggesting careful placement that contradicted the hazardous environment. The depth of the impressions indicated considerable weight, but snow compression alone could not account for the clarity of the edges or the consistent stride. These anomalies created an unsettling paradox. The footprints were human in shape yet seemed placed by a force unconstrained by logic or conventional mountaineering limits. By sunrise, the tracks had shifted subtly, some fading entirely while others drifted in directions that defied any logical pattern. Overnight wind and temperature changes could account for minor distortions, but the movement was neither random nor uniform. Certain prints appeared farther along the ridge than any climber could have travelled in such conditions, and in some cases footprints seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving no trace beyond their immediate vicinity. The phenomenon gave the illusion of a living path, moving independently across the glacier, as if guided by unseen hands. Climbers who revisited these areas often found the prints altered or entirely gone, creating a temporal and spatial puzzle that challenged both observation and understanding. Climbers navigating the slopes struggled to interpret the prints, aware that following them could lead to dangerous ice formations or hidden crevices. Every attempt to track the path was complicated by windblown snow, unstable ice, and the fog that persisted even in early morning light. Some expeditions tried to measure stride length, depth, and orientation, hoping to find patterns that might explain the print's origin, but results only deepen the mystery. The psychological effect of tracing ephemeral tracks in a forbidding environment heightened tension, as the mountain seemed to obscure answers even as it offered tantalizing clues. Observers noted a growing sense of dislocation, a feeling that the glaciers themselves were reshaping both space and perception in subtle, inexplicable ways. In mountaineering journals and local lore, unexplained signs are sometimes mentioned on Chimborazo's glaciers, yet none provide precise descriptions matching these footprints. Indigenous stories speak of ghostly travelers or spirits leaving ephemeral marks on high-altitude snowfields, interpreted as omens or warnings. Early climbing reports sometimes mention untraceable tracks or impressions appearing in unusual locations, though details are scarce and often anecdotal. Modern researchers consult these historical accounts, finding intriguing parallels yet no concrete evidence to explain the scale, depth, or movement of the drifting footprints. The intersection of folklore and observed phenomena suggests a mystery deeply rooted in both human imagination and the mountain's formidable presence. Scientific explanations, ice flow, wind redistribution, or animal activity offer partial insight, yet none fully account for the size, arrangement, and sudden disappearance of the prints. Glaciologists acknowledge that ice can shift subtly, creating impressions and fractures that might mimic footprints, but the precision and continuity of these marks defy normal processes. Wind can erode and deposit snow, but it cannot create sequential impressions with consistent stride and depth. Local wildlife, including llamas and Andean foxes, leave tracks, yet their footprints are markedly different in shape and scale. Every attempted rationalization highlights a gap between natural expectation and observed reality, reinforcing the sense that Chimborazo guards phenomena that resist conventional explanation. Having withdrawn from the high slopes, climbers carried the memory of the drifting footprints, a silent puzzle etched into memory rather than the snow. Conversations continued long after expeditions ended, as observers attempted to reconcile physical evidence with logic. Maps, photographs, and measurements could only partially capture the phenomenon, and even these records failed to reproduce the eerie impression of movement across the glacier. Researchers remained divided between those advocating for natural explanations and those conceding the possibility of something inexplicably anomalous. The footprints, both tangible and elusive, left a lingering impression of the mountain's capacity to challenge human perception and understanding, a subtle reminder of the Andes' enduring mysteries. The footprints vanish as quickly as they appear, leaving Chimborazo to guard its secret with silent, icy patience. The vanished lake of Antofagasta de la Sierra. What had once been a placid lake shimmering across the high-altitude plains of Antofagasta de la Sierra had inexplicably disappeared, leaving a stark, cracked basin in its place. Local herders and villagers first noticed the change with unease, recalling the lake's presence as a constant landmark in an otherwise desolate landscape. Travellers who relied on its waters for guidance found only dry sediment and scattered tufts of grass where ripples had once reflected the sun. Observers struggled to reconcile memory with the stark reality before them, the sudden disappearance lending the high plains an eerie emptiness. Questions spread quickly among locals and visiting scientists alike. How could a lake vanish entirely from such a remote, seemingly stable region? The absence of water transformed the landscape into something alien, a high-altitude desert where permanence had once seemed assured. The plateau around the area rises in vast volcanic expanses, dotted with salt flats and hardened lava flows, a harsh environment where water is rare and life precarious. Temperatures swing dramatically between day and night, and high winds sweep across the plains with unrelenting force, shaping the terrain in subtle but constant ways. Seasonal streams trickle from melting snow on distant peaks, feeding the fragile ecology, yet none could account for the sudden disappearance of a substantial body of water. Vegetation clings stubbornly to volcanic soil, with resilient shrubs and sparse grasses marking where moisture remains, yet the lake bed itself appeared almost entirely devoid of life. The plateau's isolation amplifies the sense of wonder and unease, emphasizing the improbability of such a sudden environmental change. Historical maps and early explorer journals record the lake as a steady presence, its waters reflecting the sky and nearby volcanic peaks with remarkable clarity. 19th century explorers described the lake as a hub for wildlife and a reliable source of water in their arduous journeys, often noting the subtle movements of flocks and herds that came to drink. Indigenous records and oral histories speak of the lake as a sacred or significant place, its presence woven into seasonal cycles and spiritual observances. Cartographers consistently marked its location, and satellite imagery in the modern era confirmed its long-standing stability. The sudden absence of water contradicts centuries of observation, transforming a familiar landmark into an enigmatic void. Reports indicate that the lake began to recede rapidly, with some witnesses noting a sudden drop in water levels that defied ordinary seasonal fluctuation. Farmers described the waters shrinking in mere weeks, leaving exposed mud and salt deposits where fish and aquatic plants had once thrived. Travellers attempting to cross the plains during this period found the familiar landscape altered, with dry channels replacing shallow inlets. Local accounts suggest that the retreat was not gradual but abrupt, with the lake bed cracking under the sun as water vanished seemingly overnight. The speed of the disappearance heightened the sense of urgency and mystery, prompting inquiries from scientists and explorers who had long studied the region. The exposed lake bed revealed concentric sediment rings, mineral deposits, and channels carved into soft earth, suggesting forces both powerful and unusual at work. Geologists examining the area observed unusual fissures and depressions, some filled with residual moisture, but none capable of explaining the full extent of the lake's loss. The sediment layers hinted at long-term accumulation, indicating that this body of water had endured for centuries, perhaps millennia. Mineral patterns suggested rapid exposure to air and sunlight, causing chemical reactions that transformed the lake bed's appearance almost immediately. Observers noted the eerie uniformity of the cracks and the absence of traditional drainage paths, emphasizing the inexplicable nature of the vanishing waters. Geologists and hydrologists debated possible explanations, from subterranean fissures and volcanic seepage to extreme evaporation under the relentless high-altitude sun. The region's volcanic history includes occasional seismic activity, but no recorded earthquake coincided with the lake's disappearance. Underground channels could theoretically siphon water, yet investigations failed to identify sufficient conduits capable of draining such a volume. Seasonal evaporation occurs at high altitude, but the rate required to empty the lake so quickly exceeds normal climatological expectations. Despite careful analysis, no singular explanation emerged, leaving both scientific and local communities grappling with the lake's sudden absence. According to local inhabitants and indigenous storytellers, there are legends of lakes that vanish and return, sometimes in connection with omens, spirits, or celestial phenomena. Some describe lakes that retreat only to reappear years later, their cycles mysterious and poorly understood. Others warn of sacred guardians, invisible forces that claim waters when human activity disrupts balance. While these accounts blend myth and cultural memory, they resonate with the strange, almost sentient nature of the lake's disappearance. Even scientists studying the area acknowledge the psychological weight of such stories, recognizing that human interpretation of natural phenomena often blends awe with fear. The lake's disappearance remains a mystery, persisting despite scientific scrutiny and historical research, leaving observers with a sense of unease and unresolved curiosity. Satellite images show a barren basin, yet evidence suggests that the water may exist below the surface in hidden channels or subterranean reservoirs. The absence transforms both navigation and memory, as maps and mental landmarks no longer match the reality of the plains. Visitors remark on a palpable emptiness, a void that extends beyond the physical into perception itself. The lake's vanishing defies simple understanding, remaining one of the Andes' quiet, unyielding mysteries. The vanished waters of Antofagasta de la Sierra linger only in memory, a silent reminder of the Andes' ability to erase what was once seemingly permanent. The pulsing glaciers of El Plomo. On the towering slopes of El Plomo, glaciers have been observed to pulse in a rhythm that defies ordinary ice movement, unsettling those who witness it. Climbers and researchers alike report a subtle swelling and contracting of the ice, sometimes accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible vibration that seems to emanate from deep within the glacier itself. These pulses are not seasonal, nor do they align with the expected flow of meltwater or gravitational creep. Visitors describe a sense of disorientation, as if standing on a living surface that breathes in slow, deliberate waves. The phenomenon has drawn attention from both mountaineers and glaciologists, prompting careful observation and repeated visits, yet the underlying cause remains elusive, leaving those who witness it in quiet, uneasy wonder. The glaciers stretch across steep ridges, feeding into deep valleys carved by centuries of ice, where temperatures fluctuate dramatically between day and night. Snow accumulates in layers that compress into dense ice, forming a lattice of crevasses and seracs that constantly shift under pressure. Winds sweep across the ridges, carrying fine ice particles that glint in the high-altitude sunlight, and the thin air enhances both the cold and the eerie stillness of the mountains. In this remote and inhospitable terrain, even minor movements of the ice are magnified, creating an uncanny impression that the glacier itself is restless. The stark contrast between the slow, massive weight of the ice and its sudden, rhythmic pulses heightens the sense that something unusual is taking place. Early mountaineers and explorers noted sudden shifts in ice formations, describing movements that seemed too deliberate to be natural, while local guides spoke of subtle tremors beneath the surface. Journals from the late 19th century mention ice blocks tilting or cracking without apparent cause, and photographs show unusual patterns in the crevasses that suggest a previously unrecorded dynamism. Indigenous accounts from the high valleys describe glaciers as breathing or moving to a hidden rhythm, interpretations long dismissed as folklore, yet now echoing modern observations. These historical records underscore that the phenomenon is not new, and that the pulsing of El Plomo's glaciers may have been ongoing for generations, largely unnoticed until observers with precise attention documented it. In some cases, observers have recorded instances where the ice appears to swell, ripple or surge unexpectedly, sometimes creating patterns of crevasses that shift in tandem with these pulses. Video recordings capture subtle undulations, while time-lapse photography reveals an almost imperceptible expansion and contraction of the glacier's surface. In some cases, small rockfalls occur in coordination with the ice's movement, suggesting that stress is transmitted through the ice to the surrounding slopes. Researchers climbing adjacent peaks have reported feeling vibrations beneath their feet that correspond with these pulses, as though the glacier itself is communicating through motion. The phenomenon seems deliberate and patterned, yet it resists rational explanation within conventional glaciology. Exposed ice fractures, displaced debris, and subtle fissures suggest forces acting beneath the surface, hinting at movement that is both physical and enigmatic. Meltwater streams sometimes emerge from unexpected fissures, only to vanish beneath the ice again, creating subterranean channels that shift over time. Large ice blocks tilt and fracture with no apparent cause, leaving temporary ridges and hollows that resemble the deliberate work of an unseen hand. Even wind patterns and temperature fluctuations fail to fully account for the glacier's rhythmic pulsing. The visible traces are fleeting, disappearing as quickly as they appear, reinforcing the sense that the glacier is not simply responding to environmental forces, but behaving in ways that remain largely inscrutable. Glaciologists speculate about possible explanations, from meltwater surges trapped beneath the glacier to seismic vibrations or atmospheric pressure variations, yet none fully accounts for the regularity of the pulses. Some researchers suggest that the glacier may interact with hidden subglacial channels, where pressure builds and releases in cycles that ripple through the ice above. Others consider microseismic activity or subtle shifts in the mountain's tectonic plates as potential triggers. Yet these theories only partially explain the observations, leaving a residual mystery about the timing, rhythm, and apparent sentience of the ice. Every expedition uncovers more questions than answers, deepening both scientific curiosity and human unease. When near the pulsing ice, climbers recount a disorienting sensation, as if the glacier itself is conscious, its rhythm exerting an almost imperceptible influence on the surrounding air. Shadows shift along crevasses in synchrony with subtle surface movements, and the glacier's edges sometimes seem to swell toward observers before retreating. Even experienced mountaineers report moments of vertigo or heightened awareness, a perceptual effect that suggests human perception itself is unsettled by the phenomenon. Camps established near the ice are often filled with a quiet tension, as though the glacier's slow pulse communicates a warning or a presence beyond human understanding. The interplay between observation and interpretation creates a sense of psychological immersion that is inseparable from the physical reality of the glacier's strange motions. After detailed observation and repeated study, the glacier's peculiar pulsing continues, eluding definitive explanation and leaving a lingering sense of mystery over the high Andes. Expeditions document movement patterns, record microseismic activity, and measure temperature variations, yet none can predict or fully replicate the phenomenon. The glaciers defy categorization as either ordinary ice or as an entirely new natural anomaly. Scholars, mountaineers, and local guides alike accept that some aspects of the pulsing remain unknowable, a reminder of the Andes' capacity to surprise and confound. The glaciers are at once majestic and inscrutable, their silent cadence an enduring enigma. The frozen expanse of El Plomo holds glaciers that move with a silent cadence that challenges understanding, a frozen heartbeat of the Andes that may conceal secrets yet unseen. The unseen pursuer of Nevado, Ausang Gate. A cold wind sweeps across the slopes of Nevado Ausangate, carrying with it a stillness that feels watched, as if the mountain itself observes every movement. The ice and rock glint under a thin sunlight that barely warms the high-altitude air, and shadows stretch across the jagged terrain in ways that seem deliberate, almost sentient. As climbers ascend narrow ridges and traverse glacial flats, a subtle tension settles over them, an unnameable feeling that they are never entirely alone. Small disturbances in the snow or the slight echo of distant rocks shifting give the impression of an unseen presence moving in concert with their own steps. The phenomenon is not immediately visible, yet it shapes perception, altering how sound, shadow, and movement are experienced in these vast, unforgiving heights. Jagged ridges and glacial valleys stretch into isolation, where shifting shadows and sudden gusts of wind turn familiar paths into uncanny terrain. Crevasses and ice walls form labyrinthine corridors, and the thin air amplifies both sound and silence, turning the simplest echo into a startling signal. The mountain's geography creates natural optical illusions, yet some disturbances resist explanation, as though an invisible observer manipulates perception itself. Every uneven stone, every shifting snowdrift seems to take on significance, leaving climbers to question whether the mountain is acting alone or whether something else shares its slopes. The combination of isolation and altitude heightens awareness, sharpening senses while feeding unease. Ancient tales passed down by local communities speak of invisible presences that accompany travellers, leaving subtle signs where none should exist. Indigenous guides describe mountain spirits that follow and watch, sometimes revealing themselves through minor alterations in terrain or a sudden, inexplicable sound. Early explorers recorded strange sensations of being followed in journals, noting footsteps that did not belong to anyone and rocks displaced without cause. These accounts suggest that the phenomenon is neither recent nor singular, hinting at a long-standing interaction between humans and an elusive aspect of the mountain. Folklore and observation converge, creating a layered mystery that blends cultural memory with contemporary experience. Sometimes, rocks appear slightly displaced, or faint impressions in the snow are visible to climbers, vanishing upon a second glance and reinforcing a sense of unseen observation. A loose stone might appear near a resting spot or along a path where no one had passed, while subtle depressions in snow reveal a footprint that seems to materialize and disappear. In some cases, faint shadows on slopes do not correspond with any physical feature, or small avalanches occur in isolated patches without triggering larger movement. These phenomena suggest forces at play beyond wind or gravity, leaving an impression of the deliberate intent. The mountain becomes a space where the known laws of motion and perception intersect with something wholly unexplainable. These disturbances often follow patterns, coinciding with changes in direction or moments of rest, suggesting an awareness beyond natural forces. Observers note that when they pause or change course, subtle alterations in snow, ice and rock appear in their wake as if mirroring their actions. The regularity and timing of such occurrences imply that this presence is not random but attentive, tracking movement in a way that challenges conventional understanding. Even experienced mountaineers, accustomed to unpredictable terrain and harsh conditions, report a deepened sense of vulnerability, as though the mountain itself has become an arena for observation rather than traversal. Considered by experts are explanations such as wind-driven debris, optical illusions, or high-altitude effects on perception, yet these do not fully account for the precise timing and repetition of the phenomena. Gusts can dislodge stones, sunlight can distort shadows, and fatigue can heighten awareness of imagined movement, yet these variables alone fail to reproduce the consistent patterns documented by multiple observers. Seismic tremors are infrequent and too weak to explain shifting impressions, and wildlife in the area is either too small or too sparse to account for disturbances of the scale reported. Each scientific hypothesis illuminates part of the puzzle but leaves the core mystery intact, reinforcing the Andes as a landscape where the line between natural law and unexplained phenomena is thin and uncertain. The sensation of being accompanied creates an undercurrent of tension, where silence is heavy, and every step seems to echo with untraceable intent. Mountaineers speak of heightened perception, a sense of instinctively knowing that movement occurs nearby even when no source can be seen. The interplay of wind, shadow, and ice becomes a theatre of the unknown, and moments that might otherwise be mundane, crossing a narrow ridge, climbing a crevasse wall, pausing at a vista, are charged with anxiety and awe. Travellers report sudden chills or brief feelings of vertigo, subtle physiological responses that accompany the awareness of a presence just beyond sight, a companion that is both absent and undeniable. Return visits and close observation still could not reveal the presence, leaving only fleeting evidence that sparks both curiosity and unease. Expeditions leave detailed logs of footsteps, stone displacements, and subtle tremors, yet each subsequent visit reveals nothing overt. The phenomenon eludes capture by photography or video, and measurements of wind, temperature, and seismic activity often show no correlation. This persistent elusiveness creates a unique tension. The mountain seems to have a life of its own, a rhythm or awareness that interacts with those who enter it. The more it is studied, the more it preserves its secrets, leaving only speculation and a growing sense of wonder. The unseen pursuer of Nevado Ausangate moves in the periphery of perception, an invisible shadow that refuses to be explained and cannot be ignored. The metallic chorus of Pocsi Ridge. A series of sharp metallic tones echoes across Pocsi Ridge, cutting through the thin air and carrying a resonance that seems deliberately composed. The sounds strike unexpectedly, bouncing off jagged rock faces and glacial ice, shimmering with an almost musical quality that defies immediate explanation. Travellers ascending the ridge report a strange rhythm in the tones, sometimes harmonizing like a distant choir, other times clanging in abrupt, discordant bursts. The high-altitude air, thin and crisp, allows these sounds to travel further than would seem possible, reaching ears across valleys and ridgelines in ways that confound standard acoustic theory. For those who experience it, the chorus becomes both mesmerizing and unsettling, a presence that is heard but never seen, as if the ridge itself were alive with an invisible orchestra. The ridge's ragged formations and narrow valleys act as natural amplifiers, causing even minor sounds to reverberate with surprising intensity across vast distances. Ice-clad cliffs and serrated rock spires catch the vibrations, reflecting and splitting them into overlapping patterns that confuse perception. Gusts of wind swirl unpredictably through these channels, sometimes dampening the tones, other times enhancing them in ways that seem almost intentional. Climbers note that the sounds often shift in pitch and duration depending on location, suggesting a phenomenon intricately linked to the terrain itself. Even at rest, travellers report hearing echoes from directions where no source can be found, reinforcing the impression of a purposeful, ghostly resonance. Miners and early explorers documented strange harmonics along these slopes, often attributing them to spirits of the mountains or hidden natural chambers that magnified sound. Journals from the late 19th and early 20th centuries describe sharp metallic clangs that occurred without warning, unsettling both indigenous guides and European mountaineers. Some accounts mention patterns that mirrored human movement, as though the ridge responded to the presence of those traversing it. Local folklore preserves similar tales, describing the ridge as a living entity that communicates through sound, warning, or testing those who venture too far. These historical records demonstrate that the phenomenon is not a fleeting modern curiosity, but a long-standing mystery embedded in both geography and culture. Modern climbers report hearing the metallic chorus during moments of stillness, describing rhythmic sequences that fluctuate in pitch and seem to follow them along the path. A brief pause while ascending may trigger a series of high, bell-like tones, which continue even after movement resumes. The sounds often emerge without a visible source, sometimes seeming to originate from beneath ice layers or from fissures in the rock. Witnesses describe a heightened awareness, as if the ridge itself monitors their passage, revealing subtle changes in tone and cadence with every step. These first-hand experiences echo their historical accounts, suggesting a continuity of perception that transcends individual imagination. Field notes reveal peculiar patterns in the phenomenon, with intervals of silence and resonance appearing almost too structured to be purely coincidental. The metallic tones sometimes occur in sequences of 3 or 4, separated by deliberate pauses, or rising crescendo before suddenly fading. Climbers have recorded these sequences in audio logs, yet attempts to replicate them using known acoustic principles have failed. The precision and consistency challenge conventional explanations and hint at an unknown mechanism, whether natural or otherwise. Even those accustomed to harsh mountain environments admit a sense of uncanny timing, as if the ridge itself were communicating through sound. Specialists propose explanations ranging from mineral resonance and wind-induced vibration to ice and rock fracturing, yet none fully account for the precision or musical quality of the sounds. Certain metallic ores abundant along the ridge are known to resonate under specific conditions, and glacial movement can create harmonic tones. Wind passing over fissures may produce eerie whistling or clanging, while ice cracking generates sudden sharp tones. However, none of these phenomena consistently replicates the structured, almost intentional sequences described by observers. Scientists are left with an anomaly that sits at the intersection of geology, meteorology, and auditory perception, a phenomenon documented but not understood. The auditory enigma exerts a subtle psychological pressure on travellers, heightening awareness, provoking unease, and sometimes creating the illusion of movement or presence nearby. Climbers report feeling watched or followed when the chorus begins, even though no other living beings are visible. The resonance can induce vertigo or disorientation, as the sounds appear to move independently of physical space, shifting direction and intensity unpredictably. Despite careful planning and acclimatization, those exposed to prolonged episodes describe a persistent tension, a mingling of awe and anxiety that lingers long after the ridge is left behind. The metallic chorus thus becomes more than an acoustic curiosity. It is an experience that interacts with both the landscape and the human mind. The metallic chorus persists, defying repeated study and careful measurement, leaving only recordings and first-hand accounts as evidence. Sensors and audio equipment capture some tones, but the full depth and resonance often vanish when human perception is removed. Climbers continue to approach the ridge with a mixture of anticipation and caution, aware that the sounds are unpredictable yet irresistibly compelling. The phenomenon is woven into the identity of Potosi Ridge itself, a mysterious characteristic that draws curiosity while resisting scientific resolution. On Potosi Ridge, the metallic chorus lingers in the high Andes like a ghostly symphony, a sound both beautiful and unsettling that vanishes as mysteriously as it arrives. The Lost Photographer of Cerro Mercedario. The story of the lost photographer on Cerro Mercedario begins with a camera, a seemingly ordinary device that survived a climber's disappearance to later re-emerge, bearing images that defy reason. According to fragments of the tale, the camera was recovered long after its owner vanished somewhere on the steep slopes of the Andes. When the film was developed, it revealed photographs taken from multiple ridges of the mountain, some impossibly far apart, given the limited time the photographer had and the known paths traversed by the missing party. The mystery lingers. How could one person have stood on distant ridges in differing light and terrain, without any record beyond those silent frames? Cerro Mercedario rises in the Cordillera de la Ramada in Argentina's San Juan province, reaching roughly 6,700 meters. Its slopes carry glaciers, rock ridges, and labyrinthine gullies, terrain that demands care, skill, and a slow, deliberate pace. Climbs typically begin from the town of Barrial, ascending through camps and icy paths over at least 10 days before even nearing the summit. In such an environment, the idea of covering widely separated ridges in a matter of hours, enough to photograph them, defies both human physiology and mountaineering realism. The recovered camera contained images taken under starkly different light conditions: a pale dawn illuminating a northern ridge, a midday glare reflecting off a southern wall, and even a twilight shot from what appeared to be a rocky outcrop near the summit. In between came images of deep valleys blanketed in snow, narrow ridge lines, and angles that, according to experienced mountaineers familiar with Mercedario's geography, could not logically align unless taken on routes scarcely a climber could traverse in a single day. Locals who knew the terrain examined the photos and murmured among themselves. None knew of any feasible path linking those vantage points in the given time frame. What makes the incident even more unsettling is that the original expedition never left a detailed log indicating they had split up or used ropes and equipment in the way such daring movement across different sectors would require. In fact, Mercedario's history suggests caution. The mountain sees only a handful of ascents each year, far fewer than its bulkier neighbour peaks, partly because of remote access and tricky glacial terrain. Among those ascents were careful, well-documented expeditions, yet none reported anomalies like strange camera recoveries or inexplicable route hopping. Over decades, researchers have attempted to retrace possible routes a photographer might have taken. One theory speculated the person may have used a network of small ridges and hidden couloirs, perhaps even abandoned glacial tunnels or natural ledges seldom traversed, to move stealthily across the massif. But none of these proposals fit the recorded exposure times on the film, the light gradients in the photos, or the risk such a traverse would entail without support, weather windows, or a climbing partner. The silence of the mountain and the absence of footprints or old camps corresponding to those ridges only deepen the mystery. Some hypothesize the film might have been altered later, either by someone familiar with Mercedario or by chance, such as frames from different mountains mistakenly interchanged, or the film exposed twice. But collectors and analysts found no signs of tampering. Photographic experts noted that the light angles and snow reflections matched the solar patterns expected at those altitudes and latitudes, suggesting the photos were genuine and taken on the mountain, not fabricated later in a studio. Then there is the physical fate of the camera. When it was found, reportedly near a discarded climbing pack on a glacier some hundreds of meters from the last known campsite, it was frozen solid, lens fogged, and the shutter mechanism apparently jammed. Yet after thawing, the film still produced coherent images. That almost impossible feat, survival of light-sensitive film over years in sub-zero glacial conditions, added another layer of improbability and surreal weight to the story. Many experts believe that cold slows chemical degradation, but decades on a shifting glacier with repeated freeze-thaw cycles borders on miraculous. Because of the tenuous reliability of oral accounts surrounding the incident, the story remains unofficial, existing in the margins of mountaineering lore and disappearing in most formal histories of the mountain. Official chronicles of climbs on Mercedario, including the first ascent in 1934 by a Polish expedition and subsequent ascents of challenging ridges, make no mention of such a bizarre occurrence. Yet among those who roam the region and hear from shepherds, guides, old-timer climbers and local villagers, the tale persists. In recent years, with glaciers retreating on Mercedario and neighbouring peaks, some have searched for the original camera or fragments of the photographer's gear, hoping to find more clues. None have. Melting ice has revealed occasional relics, a boot or a piece of rope, but no trace of the missing climber or definitive proof linking any artifact to the fabled photos. A boot fragment recovered in 2003 came from a ridge not depicted in any purported frame. Another rope yielded nothing matching known expedition gear lists from the era. The shifting glacier, severe weather, and remoteness of the Cordillera de la Ramada all conspire to erase traces. Trails erode, snow hides depressions, and glacial movements swallow tents. Evidence that might have settled unobtrusively on rocky ground is swept away without a trace. Occasionally, local shepherds or hikers speak of ghostly echoes, distant metal-on-rock sounds, or flash reflections on stone glimpsed from over the valley, but no one has correlated these to confirmed phenomena or linked them to the lost photographer. Mountaineering historians continue to debate the veracity of the photographs and the story's plausibility. Some argue that the mountain's unpredictable weather, crevasse fields, and dangerous ridgelines make it unlikely for a lone climber to traverse multiple sectors without leaving some record beyond a camera film. Others suggest mystery thrives in silence. Perhaps the photographer was guided by something unknown to us. For local villagers around Barreal and the valleys below Mercedario, the camera is more than curiosity. It is a warning about the mountain's vastness and the way it rearranges memory and evidence as centuries pass. For climbers drawn to the high Andes, the story remains a cautionary whisper that even with modern gear, some ridges may conceal more than snow and stone, perhaps memories, phantoms, or footprints blurred by time. Deep in the wind-slashed ridges of Mercedario, among ice, rock, and cold air, the lost photographer's silent images linger, a ghostly testimony that may speak louder than any climber's shout. The banner in the wind at Hina Pocsi. The wind tore across the upper slopes of Hina Pocsi, carrying with it a glimpse of something that should not have been there. Climbers ascending the southern face had paused near a narrow ledge, breath rasping in the thin icy air, when a flicker of colour drew their eyes upward. It was impossible at first to define a movement at the edge of perception, yet undeniable. Snow swirled around jagged rocks, gusts twisting through the glacial valleys below, and the object, a piece of fabric, white and fluttering, seemed to hang in the mountain air against every law of gravity and expectation. A slender, fluttering shape caught the climber's eyes far along a jagged ledge, whipping violently as if alive, yet the rock beneath it remained bare. They scanned the ridge carefully, noticing no rope, no human presence, and no equipment that could explain the sight. The fabric seemed to leap and bend with a purpose, turning corners and dipping into shadows where the terrain should have hidden any movement. Each climber felt a mixture of awe and unease. The sensation was almost like watching a living creature whose motions were precise yet alien, entirely separate from the known world of ice and stone. Ice-crusted ridges stretched outward, reflecting the sun in harsh streaks, while the altitude pressed cold and thin against every breath, making the impossible sight all the more jarring. Hina Pocsi, standing at 6,088 meters, rises sharply from the Bolivian Altiplano, crowned with permanent glaciers that ripple across its slopes. Standard climbing routes demand careful navigation across crevassed ice fields and seracs, with sudden drops that can shift under the slightest pressure. In this environment, every motion is measured, every gust calculated, yet the fabric's movement appeared to disregard both terrain and wind direction, defying the meticulous logic required to traverse the mountain. With crampons clinking against frozen granite, the team scrambled upward, expecting to confront the fabric that seemed to mock their approach, only to find emptiness where motion had been. The ledge, narrow and slick with frost, showed no sign of disturbance. The snow lay untouched and the rock was unscored by rope or boot. A low, constant whistle of wind filled the silence, but no other sound could explain the earlier sight. Even the seasoned guides exchanged glances, their faces shadowed with disbelief, because Hina Pocsi's geography leaves few illusions unexplained, and yet this one had escaped every reasonable explanation. Mountaineers who have traversed these slopes speak of sudden apparitions of colour and movement that vanish upon approach, and the mountain's reputation for high-altitude illusions is well known among mountaineers. Hina Pocsi has long been used as a training ground for climbers preparing for taller Andean summits, and its slopes are meticulously documented in climbing logs and guides. Despite this, oral histories mention objects and figures seen fleetingly in the upper ridges, banners, ropes, or even garments, that appear only when the observer's attention is drawn, disappearing without a trace. The phenomenon is rare, but persistent enough to be acknowledged in hushed tones by those who have spent decades navigating the ice and rock. Each gust of wind seemed to carry whispers of movement and intention, and climbers could not escape the tension between what they saw and what reason allowed them to believe. The high altitude amplified every visual and auditory perception. The thin air sharpens contrasts, the sunlight glints off ice in unexpected angles, and even minor shadows stretch unnaturally across crevasses. Yet the fabric's motions did not follow wind patterns or reflective light. It twisted against prevailing gusts and appeared to pivot around ledges that offered no mechanical support. Each movement suggested agency, as if the mountain itself were orchestrating a display, mocking human understanding. Moments later, the fabric reappeared, tantalizingly distant, its motion both familiar and impossibly untethered, teasing the edges of perception where light and shadow collided. Climbers descended slightly to gain a better angle, squinting through the glare, yet the object responded in ways that suggested anticipation. It did not flutter randomly like a flag caught in the wind. It seemed aware of the observer's gaze, slipping into view and out of reach with perfect timing. The glaciers below murmured, ice cracking in distant fissures, and every step on the ridge heightened the sense of unreality, as though the mountain surfaces themselves were shifting subtly to conceal or reveal the fabric. As the team descended, the memory of the shifting shape lingered, leaving a quiet unease that merged with the mountain's steady, indifferent presence. They spoke little, each processing what had been witnessed against their knowledge of terrain, altitude effects, and meteorology. The phenomenon resisted explanation. No trace remained, no gusts aligned with its movements, and no human hand could have staged it. Even scientific reasoning, considering wind vortices, optical illusions, and reflections on ice, fell short of fully describing the sight. Climbers knew the mountain well enough to recognize when reality bent unexpectedly, and Hina Pocsi had bent theirs. The memory of that brief encounter persisted long after they returned to lower altitudes, where oxygen was abundant and movement no longer risked frostbite or slips. Guides recounted the incident in cautious tones to colleagues and hikers, describing the impossibility of what had been observed. For those who had been present, the mountain had revealed a secret, a small fragment of something beyond ordinary perception, leaving an impression of both wonder and subtle fear. Though tangible evidence was absent, the story became embedded in the living memory of the slope, as real as any crevasse or serac encountered during the climb. Near the summit of Hina Pocsi, a piece of cloth continues to dance with the wind, unseen but impossible to forget. The ice cavern whispers of Cotopaxi. The explorers stepped cautiously into a narrow ice tunnel, their headlamps casting fractured light across walls of glimmering blue, unaware that Cotopaxi was about to speak in a language of sound. The air was sharp and thin at nearly 5,900 meters, each breath drawn with effort, carrying the faint metallic tang of glacial melt. The floor beneath their crampons was uneven, a mosaic of compacted snow and ice, punctuated by hidden fissures that could swallow a foot without warning. Even seasoned mountaineers felt an unusual stillness settle over the cavern, as if the glacier itself were holding its breath. In the distance, a soft murmur began to rise, barely perceptible at first, like the sigh of wind moving through ice, yet somehow structured, deliberate, and almost communicative. A soft rhythmic tapping echoed from the chamber beyond the next curve, repeating with such precision that it seemed deliberate, yet no human presence could be discerned. The explorers froze, listening to the cadence, a sequence that suggested intention rather than randomness, a pattern that could have been mistaken for a heartbeat or a percussion instrument struck by invisible hands. They exchanged uneasy glances, hesitant to move closer, aware that the source might be a simple natural occurrence, yet instinctively feeling that something about the sound defied normal explanation. The ice walls around them reflected and amplified the noise, creating layers of echoes that made it impossible to determine direction or distance. Frost-coated stalactites and crystalline walls amplified each footstep, each exhaled breath, creating a disorienting overlay of natural echoes that made the whispers even harder to locate. Every movement sent tremors through the brittle ice, producing small cracks and pops that blended with the mysterious tapping. The cavern twisted and branched unpredictably, a labyrinth of frozen corridors carved over centuries by slow-moving glaciers. Patches of ice glowed pale blue as light refracted within, and snow dust floated in the shafts of headlamp illumination, lending an ethereal quality to the scene. The explorers felt the tension of isolation, knowing that a single misstep could end the expedition or worse, yet drawn onward by the inexplicable sounds. Moving deeper into the labyrinth, the team mapped the passages while measuring air pressure and temperature, but every instrument failed to reveal the source of the sounds. Barometers and thermometers recorded normal variances for glacial tunnels, and microphones captured the echoes but could not explain the rhythm or the clarity of the whispers. Each tunnel had been surveyed for ice stability and potential collapse, and nothing suggested that shifting blocks or falling ice could produce the measured sequences. Yet the sounds persisted, emanating from passages that appeared empty, as though the glacier itself were alive, communicating in tones just beyond comprehension. Long-standing stories from guides and climbers hinted at similar occurrences, tales of murmurs in the ice and inexplicable rhythms that vanished as suddenly as they appeared. Local mountaineers spoke of the glacier's voice, a phenomenon passed down through generations, describing tunnels where explorers heard tapping and whispering in moments of deep silence. Early 20th century expeditions to Cotopaxi rarely mention these phenomena, but anecdotal evidence suggests that climbers navigating glaciers and caverns often reported sensations of being watched or followed by unseen sounds. While dismissed in official records as hallucinations caused by altitude and exhaustion, the persistence of the stories gave the ice a reputation for subtle, uncanny communication. Scientists suggested that ice fractures, shifting glaciers, or resonant air pockets could produce strange acoustic effects, yet these explanations fell short of describing the cadence and clarity of what was heard. Cotopaxi's glaciers form and recede with relentless movement, carving tunnels and chambers that can amplify and distort sound in unexpected ways. Ice under pressure can crack and vibrate like tuned strings, and air pockets may carry resonance for surprising distances. Yet the rhythmic quality of the whispers, repeating with a regularity beyond natural fracturing or wind turbulence, resisted all straightforward physical explanation, leaving the explorers puzzled and intrigued. With every step, the explorers felt a creeping unease, a sense that the cavern was alive with hidden movement, the frozen corridors reflecting their own tension at them. The echoes seemed to respond to their progress, fading when they paused and intensifying as they approached certain junctions. Even the faintest sound, a boot against ice or the soft exhalation of breath, appeared magnified in the cavern's acoustics, blending with the unnatural tapping in ways that suggested purpose. Their instruments remained silent regarding any human origin, reinforcing the impression that these noises were not accidental, yet no mechanism or entity could be observed within the icy depths. At the deepest intersection, the whispers intensified, almost forming patterns, pressing on the senses in a way that defied both logic and expectation, compelling the team to pause and listen. Each note of the tapping seemed deliberate, almost like a language of rhythm, impossible to translate yet unmistakably present. Light from headlamps glinted off the ice, revealing intricate textures and fissures, some so thin that air seemed to hum through them. The explorers remained motionless, caught between curiosity and caution, unable to determine whether the glacier itself was generating the phenomenon or if something entirely outside their understanding was at play. Stepping out of the ice labyrinth, the chill clinging to their clothes and skin, they carried the memory of the cavern's voices into the open air, where sunlight seemed suddenly overwhelming and unreal. The expansive volcanic slopes of Cotopaxi glimmered with snowfields and crevasses under the afternoon sun, and the ordinary sounds of wind and melting ice seemed almost mundane compared to the uncanny resonance they had left behind. Yet even in daylight, every time the wind shifted or a distant crevasse groaned, the explorers could almost hear the faint taps echoing in their minds, an imprint of a mystery that could not be fully recorded or explained. Tucked beneath Cotopaxi's glaciers, in hidden ice tunnels, a voice continues to tap and whisper, waiting for those who dare to follow it into silence. The charred stones of Nevado Sajama. The slopes of Nevado Sajama shivered under temperatures well below -20 degrees Celsius, each gust carrying the sharp tang of volcanic rock and ice. The wind whipped across the upper ridges, making every movement deliberate and measured, and the thin air pressed cold and unrelenting against exposed skin. Snow lay thick on the volcanic slopes, settling in hollows and clinging stubbornly to rock faces, yet among the frozen expanse patches of stone glimmered with an unnatural darkness. These surfaces appeared to radiate heat despite the sub-zero conditions, a subtle anomaly that immediately captured the attention of the mountaineers who had ventured far above the altiplano. The contrast of darkened rock against white frost created a jarring, almost otherworldly tableau, hinting at a mystery the mountain had hidden for decades. Patches of rock appeared strangely dark, their surfaces absorbing light as if emanating warmth contrary to the frigid air. The circle of boulders was startling in its uniformity, each stone nearly identical in size and spacing, forming a geometric pattern that would have been difficult to achieve even under temperate conditions. Frost coated the tops of the stones, but the blackened surfaces beneath were untouched, revealing no cracks, soot, or evidence of fire in the conventional sense. As sunlight caught the edges of each boulder, the shadows stretched across the snow in sharp, precise lines, highlighting the perfect alignment and emphasizing the impossibility of its formation in such a harsh environment. Expedition members adjusted their gloves and instruments, noting temperature anomalies that defied logic, while the surrounding landscape remained frozen and unyielding. Thermometers recorded readings higher than expected directly on the darkened stones, yet the snow a few meters away remained frozen solid. Infrared imaging detected residual warmth that could not be explained by sunlight alone, and the mountain's constant winds had stripped snow from surrounding ridges without affecting the scorched circle. The team meticulously documented measurements, mapping every stone and photographing angles from multiple perspectives, but the data deepened the puzzle rather than resolving it, leaving a persistent sense of unease in the freezing air. A near-perfect circle of blackened boulders revealed a symmetry that suggested deliberate arrangement rather than random natural formation. The stone's surfaces were etched with a sheen resembling heat blisters, glossy under the sun, yet the ground beneath was unaltered with no traces of ash or charred soil. The surrounding volcanic debris remained scattered in natural disorder, heightening the starkness of the circle's precision. Even the smallest rocks showed signs of blackening in exact proportion to the larger boulders, an improbable consistency that resisted explanation from environmental forces alone. Each member of the expedition could not shake the impression that the formation had been created intentionally, though by whom or what remained entirely unknown. Mountain gusts swept across the summit, yet no soot or ash marked the surrounding snow, leaving the origin of the heat-imprinted ring utterly unexplained. Nevado Sajama's upper slopes are renowned for relentless winds that shape snow cornices and polish rock faces, yet these forces had left the charred circle undisturbed. No wildfire or volcanic vent in the immediate vicinity could have produced the isolated anomaly, and the scorched stones seemed insulated from the natural extremes that normally dominate the high-altitude environment. Every gust carried the icy scent of sulfur and volcanic rock, yet the stones retained a heat and blackening that clashed with the mountain's frozen neutrality, as though a singular deliberate act had pierced the natural order. Studies of Nevado Sajama's volcanic history recorded eruptions and geothermal vents, but none corresponded to this isolated anomaly, and no lava flow had reached the site. Geological records show that Nevado Sajama is a dormant stratovolcano, with minor activity occurring centuries ago, and current thermal activity is confined to fumaroles near the summit. Scientific models could account for minor warming or localized melting, but none could replicate the even charring across multiple boulders arranged in a precise ring. Glacial ice that once extended across the slopes would have insulated or eroded any surface discoloration over decades, yet the blackened circle persisted as though immune to both time and the elements. Aymara guides recounted stories of unusual scorch marks and firestones appearing sporadically on the high slopes, legends that blurred into reality for those present. Elders spoke of the mountain's mysterious energy, describing formations that would appear suddenly and vanish without explanation, often in areas otherwise untouched by fire or volcanic activity. These tales, passed down for generations, carry the weight of cultural memory and reverence for Nevado Sajama, and the guides' accounts lent the phenomenon an eerie authenticity. The expedition members could not dismiss the possibility that they had stumbled upon one of these rare manifestations, a tangible imprint of the mountain's enigmatic character. On repeated expeditions, measurements and attempts to replicate the phenomenon failed to alter the charred circle, untouched by frost, solar variation, or wind. Each return visit confirmed the anomaly's permanence. Snow and ice slid past without altering the stones, and seasonal shifts in temperature produced no change in their blackened surfaces. Scientific tests attempted to mimic the effect using controlled heat, chemical treatments, and high-altitude simulations, yet none succeeded in reproducing the exact combination of uniform charring and geometric precision. The circle remained a stubborn puzzle, resisting every effort to explain it by known natural or human causes. Field teams documented the anomaly meticulously, yet every scientific explanation, from lightning strikes to chemical reactions, fell short of accounting for the precision and isolation of the burned formation. Lightning is common at high altitudes, but such strikes scatter debris and scorch irregularly. Chemical reactions require volatile compounds not present in the rocks. Even hypotheses involving concentrated sunlight or geothermal vents could not account for the formation's perfect symmetry. Each analysis reinforced the sense that the circle was an enduring enigma, a frozen record of an event that had somehow left its mark without leaving a trace of cause. Perched on Nevado Sajama's summit slopes, the blackened circle endures, a frozen enigma that scorches questions into the mind of anyone who dares to approach. The unreachable beacon of Ojos del Salado. A faint blinking light appeared on the distant ridge, pulsing steadily against the night sky as if marking a signal from some unreachable place. From their high camp the climbers could only stare, the thin air making every breath sharp and deliberate, while the rhythmic glow seemed impossibly precise. At nearly 7,000 meters, Ojos del Salado loomed not just as a mountain, but as an almost alien presence, its frozen slopes and jagged volcanic ridges stretching across the horizon. The light, small and distant, cut through the darkness like a beacon deliberately placed to draw the eye, yet no human presence or known device could account for it. The sense of isolation and inaccessibility hung thick in the air, as though the mountain itself had reserved this spectacle for those who dared to observe from afar. From their high camp, the climbers felt a mixture of awe and disbelief, realizing that the source of the glow lay far beyond any safe or mapped route. Binoculars revealed no movement on the ridge, no reflection from ice or rocks, nothing to indicate the origin of the blinking. The surrounding terrain was a combination of volcanic scree, ice patches and fractured rock, an environment inhospitable even for seasoned mountaineers. Each pulse of the light seemed to mock their distance, a subtle challenge that, no matter how carefully they measured their approach, the source remained stubbornly elusive. The cold settled deep into their bones, yet the glow seemed warm in contrast, an impossible juxtaposition against the arid high-altitude air. As they tried to close the distance, jagged scree and vertical faces forced hesitant retreat, underscoring the impossibility of a direct approach. Ropes were anchored, crampons dug into frozen rock, and every step forward met with cliffs or unstable volcanic scree that threatened to collapse beneath the weight. Routes that appeared passable from afar dissolved into near-vertical walls of ice and jagged stone as they drew closer, each ledge narrower than anticipated, and each overhang more treacherous. Even the most experienced climbers had to abandon their approach, retreating to campsites where the blinking light remained stubbornly distant and unyielding. The volcano's immense presence was tangible even from afar, its frozen lava flows and ice patches reflecting moonlight, giving the scene an otherworldly clarity. Ojos del Salado is the highest active volcano in the world, and the thin air above 6,000 meters creates a strange stillness, broken only by occasional gusts of frigid wind. Snowfields shimmered faintly under the stars, and volcanic rocks glinted pale orange under moonlight, a landscape that seemed both serene and threatening. Against this frozen backdrop, the blinking light was impossible to ignore, a solitary pulse defying all sense of scale and distance, a signal from a ridge that no human eye had yet approached closely enough to confirm. For years, mountaineers shared stories hinting at the light, and each new observer noted its precise, unchanging rhythm, which seemed to defy seasonal or environmental change. Veteran climbers spoke quietly of their own sightings, describing a pulse that persisted night after night and year after year. Some accounts suggested faint-coloured glows, others a steady white blink, but all agreed on the pattern's regularity. The mountain's isolation and extreme altitude had prevented direct investigation for decades, leaving the phenomenon lodged in a strange space between observation and legend. Even seasoned observers, equipped with the best instruments and experience, could only catalogue the light, never reach it. Theories were debated: atmospheric mirages, distant reflections, and rare optical phenomena, yet none could account for the light's consistent pulse or isolated position. Refractions caused by temperature gradients at high altitude were considered, but they typically shift and distort images, unlike the precise, unwavering beacon. Solar reflection from ice and volcanic rock was examined, yet the light appeared during darkness and in conditions where no sun could reach the ridge. Bioluminescent phenomena and distant human lights were theorized, but the altitude and inaccessibility made these explanations highly improbable. Every scientific hypothesis fell short of fully explaining the regularity, isolation, and persistence of the glowing signal. As the climbers lingered, a strange tension settled in the air, the blinking signal seeming almost conscious, observing as much as it was being observed. Hours passed with repeated observation, instruments recording its rhythm, yet the psychological weight of the impossible distance pressed on each mountaineer. The thin air, combined with exhaustion and altitude sickness, seemed to amplify the sense that the light had an intent, that it occupied the ridge not merely as a reflection but as a presence in its own right. Conversations grew sparse as the glow continued its silent pulse, each blink reminding observers that the source was unreachable and possibly beyond any conventional explanation. Night spent scanning the horizon revealed the light unchanged, visible yet permanently out of reach, teasing with its precise silent rhythm. Campfires flickered below, tents pitched precariously on scree, and every attempt to move closer was met with the stark reality of vertical cliffs and unstable ground. The persistence of the blinking phenomenon, unaltered by seasons, weather, or observer position, deepened the sense of mystery. It seemed to exist outside conventional time and space on the mountain, a rhythm that ignored human efforts and the natural chaos of the volcano's upper slopes. All efforts through repeated expeditions and careful documentation could not reveal the source, which remained elusive and resisted every attempt at explanation or access. Climbers returned to their base camps, photographs and recordings in hand, but no expedition had ever succeeded in touching or even fully identifying the origin of the light. It remained a puzzle lodged in the memory of those who saw it, a visual enigma that blended human curiosity with the harsh reality of the Andes' highest reaches. Each observer left with the same haunting impression, that the blinking signal was a phenomenon meant to be seen, never approached. On Ojos del Salado's forbidding heights, the solitary blinking beacon persists, a signal suspended between reality and mystery that compels anyone daring enough to search. The rope cut on Cerro El Plomo. Climbing high along Cerro El Plomo's rocky ridges, the team moved with measured precision, their ropes taut against the steep sun-baked granite. The thin air at over 5,000 meters made every step laborious, and each climber adjusted carefully to maintain balance on the jagged terrain. Cerro El Plomo, rising to 5,424 meters, is known among mountaineers for its combination of technical rock sections, icy patches, and sudden weather changes, requiring constant vigilance. The expedition had followed standard safety protocols, inspecting each anchor, knot, and rope before advancing. Yet a quiet tension lingered, as the mountain's remoteness always carries a sense of unease. When they reached the next anchor point, disbelief spread through the group as they discovered the fixed rope had been cleanly sliced, its ends smooth and unmarred by fraying. No apparent abrasion or environmental damage accounted for the precision, and the synthetic fibers seemed severed with an exactness that defied natural explanation. The climbers exchanged wary glances, each realizing that their primary safety line had been compromised in a way that could have led to serious injury or worse. The stark sunlight illuminated the rope's cut edges, emphasizing how unusual and deliberate the damage appeared against the granite backdrop. Every knot and anchor along the route had been carefully inspected, yet the cut appeared so precise that no ordinary tool or environmental factor could have caused it. Climbers had long relied on fixed ropes in this section to navigate steep gullies and vertical walls, and routine checks had never revealed damage of this nature. The team tested tension and mobility along adjacent lines, ensuring that other equipment remained intact, but the anomaly stood alone, isolated and mysterious. Its presence suggested either an unseen human intervention or some force entirely outside conventional understanding. The mountain's thin air carried a biting chill, and gusts funneled through narrow gullies, yet wind and abrasion could not account for such neat, isolated severing of synthetic fibers. Rocks tumbled silently along slopes below, and temperatures hovered well below freezing even in midday sunlight. conditions that would normally fray or stiffen rope rather than slice it cleanly. The climbers considered the improbable scenario of falling debris cutting the line, but the surrounding rock showed no evidence of scraping or collision. Every environmental factor pointed to one conclusion: the rope had been cut with intent, yet there was no one to witness or claim responsibility. Historical climbing records showed Cerro El Plomo as well-travelled, with most fixed ropes enduring years of harsh weather, yet no prior expedition reported cuts of this exact nature. The mountain has been a training ground for both Chilean and international climbers, and reports of rope damage are exceedingly rare, almost always attributable to abrasion, UV exposure, or human error. The abrupt precision of the severed rope made this incident stand out in mountaineering logs, with no comparable events recorded in the surrounding Cordillera region. Even the most meticulous teams had never encountered anything so inexplicable. Initial theories considered animal activity, careless climbers, or rare mechanical failures, but the rope's condition and the absence of footprints or nearby human traces rendered each explanation improbable. High-altitude wildlife is sparse, and there are no animals capable of producing such clean, deliberate cuts. Other climbers who had passed the route weeks earlier reported no anomalies, and no tools or equipment were missing that could account for an accidental severing. Each hypothesis seemed to crumble under scrutiny, leaving the team with a sense of helpless bewilderment. Tension grew among the team, the sense of vulnerability intensified by altitude and isolation, as every subsequent anchor point was approached with heightened caution and unease. Every step carried the knowledge that the ropes meant life and death in these exposed sections. Silence descended between climbers, broken only by the crunch of boots on gravel and the occasional call to adjust equipment. The psychological weight of the inexplicable cut amplified the physical demands of the ascent, creating a rare and palpable tension that clung to each member. Careful examination and photographic documentation revealed no signs of heat, fraying, or chemical residue, leaving the climbers with an anomaly that defied both experience and logic. Images captured from multiple angles displayed the rope's immaculate edges, emphasizing how unnatural the cut appeared. The team repeated tests for environmental damage, stretching and tugging at the fibers, and even examined the line with magnification to search for subtle clues, yet no evidence emerged to explain the severing. The mystery persisted, stubborn and unyielding, embedded in a section of mountain where human presence is minimal and the environment unforgiving. Descending with their findings, the team remained unsettled, the mystery of the severed ropes lingering as a stark reminder that not all dangers on Cerro El Plomo can be explained. Conversations were sparse, each climber lost in thought, replaying the scene of the cut rope and imagining scenarios that might account for it. The mountain returned to its indifferent silence, the gullies and ridges absorbing human presence without acknowledgement. Even as they retreated to lower elevations, the incident clung to memory, an unresolved anomaly that challenged both technical skill and rational understanding. On the windswept heights of Cerro El Plomo, the impossibly cut ropes remain a silent warning, a question that haunts every climber daring to tread the same path. The night marches of the Cordillera Vilcabamba. Darkness settled over the Cordillera Vilcabamba, the jagged ridges and deep valleys swallowed by shadows, when faint glimmers began to appear along the cliffs. From the observation point high on a remote ridge, the climbers and guides could make out a series of tiny lights moving with deliberate rhythm. The range, tucked in northern Peru, is known for its steep escarpments and dense patches of cloud forest, and the terrain below seemed impenetrable. Yet the lights traced arcs along sheer rock faces where no trail, human or animal, could exist. Their motion was steady, almost choreographed, leaving the observers uncertain whether what they were witnessing was natural, supernatural, or some optical illusion. Guides and climbers alike froze as the small torch-like lights traced lines across sections where no human path could exist, their motion deliberate and eerily uniform. Each blink and movement seemed synchronized, as though following a route invisible to human eyes. Attempts to interpret the lights as distant lanterns or headlamps failed. The angles made such explanations implausible, and no sound accompanied the procession. The eerie certainty that something was moving along inaccessible cliffs left the group both fascinated and apprehensive, highlighting the unusual combination of isolation and proximity that defines these high-altitude Peruvian ranges. Steep ravines and vertical walls loomed on either side, the terrain so rugged that any attempt to follow the lights would have been impossible without specialized climbing equipment. The Vilcabamba is one of the most technically challenging ranges in the Andes, with sheer rock faces interrupted by narrow ledges and sudden drop-offs. Dense forests clung to some slopes while others were barren, and moonlight barely illuminated the contours of the cliffs. The observers could imagine the dangers that would face anyone attempting to traverse these sections, which reinforced the mystery of the lights moving where human passage was entirely unfeasible. The chill of high-altitude night pressed against exposed skin, and the sound of distant wind through the forested valleys seemed to accentuate the ghostly procession of glows. Temperatures near the upper ridges often dropped below freezing, and gusts funneled through ravines, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. Every subtle flicker in the darkness became amplified, every movement along the cliffs registered with heightened intensity. The climber's pulse quickened not only because of physical exposure, but because of the inexplicable phenomenon in front of them, a luminous display that defied both expectation and experience. Accounts from multiple expeditions confirmed the recurring appearance of these lights in the same locations, always along cliffs that defied human passage. Guides who had traversed the Cordillera Vilcabamba for decades recalled similar sightings, noting that they were more frequent on nights with clear skies and minimal wind. Locals occasionally reported faintly glowing lines moving high above valleys, sometimes vanishing as suddenly as they appeared. Despite decades of anecdotal documentation, no expedition had ever explained the origin of these ephemeral illuminations, leaving the sightings lodged in a liminal space between legend and empirical observation. Those present debated possible explanations: isolated campfires, shifting shadows, and rare optical effects, yet none fully accounted for the precise rhythm, trajectory, and consistency of the glowing forms. Reflections of distant lights across clouds or atmospheric distortions could occasionally produce fleeting glimmers, but these did not account for lights following completely inaccessible cliffs. Bioluminescent fungi or insects were also considered, yet their light is weak and diffuse, incapable of forming linear moving patterns visible at such a distance. The more the climbers analysed, the more the phenomenon resisted rational explanation, deepening the sense of unease and fascination. As the marchers continued, a profound stillness settled over the observers, their senses heightened, and every flicker of light seemed imbued with intent and awareness. The rhythmic motion created an almost hypnotic effect, a silent cadence that contrasted with the wind's irregular gusts. Some climbers felt a visceral awareness of being watched, as if the procession were conscious, and every blink of light punctuated the vast, darkened landscape. Despite being physically safe on their observation point, the group experienced an emotional vulnerability unique to extreme isolation and exposure in high mountains. Photographing or recording the lights revealed only fleeting traces, faint blurs that vanished upon closer inspection, leaving no tangible evidence of the phenomenon. Cameras and night vision equipment captured only occasional points of brightness, too inconsistent to map or analyse fully. Even when climbers returned the following nights, hoping to document the movement, the lights appeared sporadically and elusively, further cementing their reputation as mysterious and unpredictable. These challenges reinforced the impression that the night marchers were not merely a trick of perception, but something persistent and undetermined. By dawn, the lights had disappeared, leaving climbers with the memory of movement where none should have been, an image that would linger long after the mountains returned to silence. The first rays of sunlight revealed sheer rock faces and forested slopes devoid of any path or human trace, yet the mental imprint of the luminous procession endured. Even with clear daylight revealing every crevice, the participants understood that what they had witnessed could not be recreated or approached directly. The Cordillera Vilcabamba retained its secrets, indifferent to human curiosity and observation. On the remote heights of the Cordillera Vilcabamba, the night marchers endure unseen yet unmistakable, their luminous procession a riddle suspended between perception and reality. The unmoving cloud of Bariloche Range. A pale formation hovered over the highest ridge, refusing to drift as the surrounding weather shifted across the Bariloche peaks. From vantage points on lower slopes, climbers and hikers observed its dense outline against the morning sky, an anomaly among the usual patterns of cloud movement that sweep the southern Andes. The Bariloche Range, part of Argentina's northern Patagonian Andes, features steep granite ridges, deep glacial valleys, and complex microclimates shaped by elevation and orientation. Normally, clouds form and dissolve quickly across these peaks, carried by strong westerly winds and the convection currents of the valleys below. Yet this particular cloud remained stubbornly fixed, as if suspended by an invisible tether. Onlookers scanning the valley below could not reconcile the cloud's stillness with the brisk gusts that bent nearby trees and swept through passes. Winds at elevations above 1,800 metres typically twist and funnel between ridges, forcing even dense formations to scatter or shift. Observers noted smaller, wispy clouds moving past it, some breaking into fragments or dispersing entirely, while the unmoving mass held its shape with remarkable consistency. Guides familiar with these slopes described it as a rare and unsettling sight, one that contrasted sharply with decades of predictable weather patterns in the region. Shadows played along the slopes as sunlight struck the white mass, revealing a dense, almost solid consistency that contradicted ordinary clouds. Its edges remained sharply defined, resisting the gradual diffusion that clouds usually undergo in sunlight and wind. Hikers reported a feeling of unreality. The landscape transformed as the stationary cloud created a visual anchor that altered perspective across steep valleys and ridgelines. Even the angle of light did little to reveal any internal turbulence, leaving the cloud seeming unnaturally still. Temperature readings fluctuated sharply on exposed ledges, yet the formation maintained an unbroken line, as though anchored to an unseen force. Morning temperatures on the peaks ranged near freezing, while sunlit lower slopes warmed rapidly, creating standard thermal currents that normally disperse or carry clouds along. Instruments monitoring wind speed, barometric pressure, and humidity recorded entirely normal readings, yet the formation remained unmoved. Observers struggled to reconcile the data with what they could see, a stark reminder that the natural world can defy expectation. Observers returning at dusk found the anomaly unchanged, contrasting sharply with the rapidly moving banks of mist curling along lower ridges. The cloud's persistence through shifting light conditions and changing wind directions only deepened the sense of strangeness. Some hikers noted how it seemed to maintain the same shape and density, a subtle but undeniable defiance of all surrounding atmospheric activity. The effect created a heightened tension in the landscape, a quiet impossibility hanging above familiar terrain. Speculation arose about stable air layers or rare inversions, but the precise suspension and compact form continued to defy conventional meteorology. Mountain meteorologists explain that temperature inversions can trap moisture in specific layers, sometimes producing unusually stationary fog or cloud decks. Yet the cloud observed in Bariloche maintained a distinct volume, did not thin, and was isolated from other formations. No thermal or pressure readings fully accounted for why it remained concentrated in one place, while all neighbouring clouds moved normally. Silence settled over the ridge as the cloud hung unmoving, its presence transforming familiar valleys into an alien landscape of scale and perspective. Observers felt both awe and unease, as if witnessing something simultaneously natural and impossible. The lack of movement rendered familiar sounds and sights strange. Rushing streams, rustling trees, and shifting clouds in the distance contrasted against the surreal stability above. The phenomenon became an unspoken focus for reflection, compelling even seasoned mountaineers to pause and take in the incongruity of the moment. Recording instruments captured minimal variance, revealing only the surrounding weather's activity, while the formation itself seemed untouched by wind or pressure changes. Photographs and video showed subtle lighting variations, but no discernible motion within the cloud, and repeated attempts at documentation failed to clarify its nature. Weather station data corroborated that environmental conditions were entirely normal, intensifying the mystery. Those present were left with the uneasy impression that the cloud had an independent presence, resisting the dynamics of the atmosphere itself. By morning, the formation gradually dissolved, leaving only the empty sky and a lingering sense of wonder among those who had observed its impossible stasis. Observers reflected on how the anomaly had altered their perception of time and space across the peaks. Its sudden disappearance offered no resolution, only the quiet acknowledgement that some phenomena exist beyond immediate understanding. even with subsequent studies, no explanation fully accounted for the cloud's behaviour, leaving it suspended in memory as a compelling testament to the Andes' capacity for mystery. Hovering above the rugged peaks and sweeping valleys of the Bariloche Range, the unmoving cloud persists in memory, a quiet enigma suspended between nature and the observer's gaze. The hollow knocking of Cerro Bonete Chico. Echoes of a deep hollow knock first drew attention as the expedition ascended the jagged volcanic slopes of Cerro Bonete Chico. The team had been navigating steep scree and volcanic rock, the kind of terrain that demands focus with every step, when the rhythmic tapping began. At first, it seemed like some climber testing a tool or striking the rock in jest, but no one had moved, and the sound continued, reverberating across the ridges in a cadence both steady and deliberate. Cerro Bonete Chico, rising over 6,700 meters in northwestern Argentina, is composed of volcanic tuff and andesite, formations prone to fissures and fractures, yet the knocks carried with a clarity that suggested intentionality rather than random collapse. Exchanging uncertain glances, the climbers listened to the rhythmic sounds reverberate through rocky valleys that offered no visible source. The hollow quality made it almost musical, a drumbeat echoing through the thin air at high altitude. The surrounding terrain is fractured and uneven, with steep faces and narrow ledges, yet the sound seemed perfectly timed, almost engineered, and it travelled farther than the team expected from any small rock or shifting scree. The strikes were neither faint nor irregular. They commanded attention, a pulse that seemed to mark time in a landscape otherwise silent, but for the distant wind. Sharp ridges and fissured rock faces amplified the impact, sending precise drum-like reverberations across the otherwise silent mountain. Some knocks resonated multiple times, bouncing between opposing cliffs and creating overlapping echoes that distorted direction and distance. The mountain itself seemed to become a chamber, turning natural rock into an instrument that transmitted sound in ways the climbers had never anticipated. Every repetition added to the sensation that the mountain was alive in some unseen manner, communicating through a medium that challenged conventional understanding. The knocks returned at intervals so consistent that observers could almost anticipate each strike, as if some unseen force maintained a pattern. Over several minutes, the rhythm became hypnotic, each sound landing like a metronome against the mental and physical strain of high-altitude climbing. The phenomenon created a sense of order within chaos, a patterned anomaly amid the unpredictable environment of loose rock, cliffs, and gusting winds. For the climbers, the regularity of the knocks produced both fascination and unease. The sounds were tangible and measurable, yet no source could be located. Trying to approach or trace the sounds proved impossible, with sheer cliffs and unstable scree preventing any closer investigation. Expedition members climbed along adjacent ridges and peered into narrow gullies, only to find empty spaces, fractured rock, and occasional frozen debris, all normal for a high-altitude volcanic environment. The knocks did not originate from any visible fracture or displaced boulder, and moving closer only changed the echo's characteristics, not the source. The mountain maintained its secret, each investigation deepening the sense that the phenomenon was independent of human interference. Several natural explanations were considered: shifting ice within fissures, minor rock collapses or subterranean tremors, yet none accounted for the regular timing and clarity of each knock. Ice within volcanic rock can produce cracking sounds as temperatures fluctuate, and minor seismic tremors can generate rumbling or tapping, but both are typically irregular and lack the precision observed. Wind can also create vibration against rock, though conditions were mostly calm and the knocks persisted without variation, even when gusts temporarily intensified. No combination of known factors fully accounted for the auditory pattern that captivated the climbers. As hours passed, the phenomenon seemed to embed itself in the climbers' awareness, every sound magnified by the isolation and altitude of the Andes. The team reported a heightened sensitivity to every minor noise, from shifting gravel to distant birds, yet nothing matched the hollow knock's intensity. The effect was both psychological and physical. The thin mountain air amplified perception, and the body's own fatigue heightened awareness of rhythm and repetition. The combination of environmental extremity and inexplicable sound produced a surreal state, as if the mountain had imposed its own temporal logic upon the observers. recording equipment captured only the echoes bouncing unpredictably across the landscape, offering clues about acoustics but none about the origin. Microphones and portable audio recorders revealed that the sound travelled unevenly, affected by cliff orientation, fissures, and narrow ravines, but never pinpointed a definitive source. The recordings preserved the rhythm and tone, a faint drumbeat echoing through the Andes, yet, removed from the landscape, the phenomenon's visual and emotional impact was largely lost. Even detailed spectral analysis failed to identify any standard natural cause. When night came, the knocking faded, leaving a lingering tension and the stark knowledge that something in the mountain itself had produced the sounds without visible cause. The climbers descended with a mix of exhaustion and fascination, recounting the intervals and tone of the knocks repeatedly. In their memory, the hollow sounds remained vivid, embedded in the terrain's memory as surely as the rock itself. Cerro Bonete Chico returned to silence, yet the rhythm lingered in imagination, a subtle heartbeat of the Andes that refused explanation. Locked in the rocky core of Cerro Bonete Chico, the hollow knocks remain an unsolved rhythm, a pulse of the Andes that refuses explanation. The last signal from Illimani. Thin air and biting wind surrounded the climbers as they neared Illimani's summit, when a crackling radio transmission cut through the high-altitude silence. The team had been navigating the steep glaciated ridges and crevasse slopes that define this 438-metre peak, part of the Cordillera Real near La Paz, Bolivia. Illimani is known for its sharp granite spires and heavy glacial coverage, where sudden weather changes can turn a routine ascent into a struggle against frost and altitude sickness. Amid these conditions, radio communication serves as a lifeline, connecting teams across distances that visual signals cannot bridge. Yet on this day, the standard exchange was interrupted by a faint repeating tone that seemed to persist beyond the normal transmission, a phenomenon that immediately drew anxious attention. The first words from base camp were routine, confirming coordinates and weather conditions, yet a faint rhythmic tone lingered beneath the signal, almost imperceptible at first. It was not the static or interference typical of high-altitude radio operation. Climbers listening carefully noticed that the tone held a regular interval, a pattern that distinguished it from environmental noise or incidental transmission errors. In an environment where sound can behave unpredictably, reflected by snowfields, fractured rock, and ice, the persistence of this tone drew immediate unease, suggesting a phenomenon that combined natural, technical, and inexplicable elements. Pausing mid-step, climbers strained their ears as the repeating sound persisted after the voice had ended, echoing oddly through their headsets. At such altitudes, every sound is heightened. The whistling wind, the crunch of ice under crampons, and even the subtle hum of equipment. Yet this tone seemed independent of all surroundings, maintaining consistency despite gusts that bent climbing poles and scattered snow in fine clouds. Its persistence created a strange duality, part of the technological spectrum, part of the mountain itself, defying expectation and challenging the team's understanding of what the Andes could conceal. Snow and ice reflected the sun sharply, yet the sound seemed unaffected by environmental shifts, maintaining its distinct frequency even as gusts swept past the ridge. The mountain's glaciers and vertical rock faces produce echoes that can distort voice and ambient noise, but the tone remained precise, unaltered by the shifting angles of reflection. Observers later noted that its clarity defied expected patterns of signal degradation at altitude, where thin air and variable conductivity typically weaken radio reception over long distances. Even slight temperature inversions, common near the summit, failed to account for the irregularity and audibility of the signal. Attempts to recalibrate the radios produced no change. The tone continued, steady and unyielding, refusing to conform to any known technical anomaly. Teams tried adjusting antenna orientation, swapping transmitters, and verifying grounding connections, yet the pulse remained intact. The climbers began to speculate whether the mountain itself, or some unusual atmospheric phenomenon, could be amplifying or producing the sound. They considered the effects of high-altitude plasma activity, sporadic reflections off ice fields, or even subtle interference caused by solar radiation interacting with their equipment. None fully explained the signal's clarity and persistence, leaving only questions. Nearby teams tried to triangulate the source, adjusting antennas and frequencies, but mountainous terrain and glacial formations distorted signals beyond expected patterns. Illimani's complex topography, sharp ridges, ice cliffs, and deep valleys makes radio propagation unpredictable. Signals can reflect off rock faces, refract through temperature layers in the air, or even be blocked entirely by glacier walls. Despite these complications, the tone remained coherent and continuous, suggesting a stability that contradicted both technical expectation and natural conditions. Basecamp personnel reported hearing the same tone faintly, confirming that it travelled over unexpected distances without losing rhythm or clarity. Each successive attempt to communicate only reaffirmed the persistence of the tone, leaving climbers with an uncanny sense of something transmitting beyond human reach. Some described the experience as almost tangible, a presence embedded in the air that was felt as much as heard. Even when no human voices spoke over the frequency, the rhythm of the pulse continued, a metronome-like reminder of an unknown origin. It created a strange psychological pressure, turning the usually exhilarating summit experience into a tense vigil, eyes scanning slopes for any possible explanation, while the snowfields glimmered coldly around them. Anxiety and fascination mingled as the sound pressed against the limits of comprehension, amplified by isolation, altitude, and the unforgiving landscape surrounding them. Teams reflected on the interplay of natural and technological factors, considering ionospheric reflections, equipment quirks, or overlapping frequencies from distant stations, yet none accounted fully for what they were experiencing. The tone had a deliberate quality, a mechanical or methodical rhythm that intensified its inexplicability in a setting governed by unpredictability. The phenomenon lingered in the mind as if the mountain itself had inscribed an audible signature into the experience of those who listened. By the time the team descended into lower camps, the signal had vanished, leaving nothing but the memory of its precise, unbroken rhythm and the questions it raised. Its disappearance did not explain, only the enduring sense that something on Illimani, be it natural, technological, or entirely unknown, had imprinted itself audibly on the experience of those who listened. Climbers would recall the sound for years, a persistent mystery suspended above glaciers and rock, where human perception and the mountain's secrets intersected. Even in quiet camps below the snow line, the thought of the pulse lingered, a subtle echo in memory that defied both reason and expectation. Set high above the glaciers and jagged peaks of Illimani, the last signal lingers in memory, a mysterious pulse that defies both explanation and silence.